I had been working too much that year, spending almost every day behind a computer, doing the same things over and over again until my mind felt like it was shutting down. I remember sitting in my apartment one night and feeling like I couldn't breathe anymore. The air felt heavy, and every sound from outside annoyed me. I wanted quiet. I wanted a place where there was nothing but stillness. That's when I started looking for cabins to rent somewhere far from the city. I found one on a small listing site. It was described as an old but comfortable wooden cabin deep in the northern woods, about 2 hours from the nearest small town. The pictures looked simple: one room, a small kitchen, a bathroom, and a porch facing the forest. The owner mentioned it had no phone service, but said there was a small radio and solar power for lights. I didn't even think twice. I booked it for a week. I wanted peace, quiet, and isolation. The drive there was long and lonely. Once I left the main highway, the roads turned narrow and rough, winding through endless trees. My GPS lost signal not long after, and I had to rely on the printed directions the owner had sent me. The dirt road stretched for miles with no signs of people anywhere. The air grew colder, and the trees stood tall and thick, their branches stretching over the road, making it feel like a tunnel. I remember how strange it felt driving there, like I was entering somewhere that wasn't meant to be reached. When I finally found the cabin, it looked smaller than I expected. The wood was dark, weathered, and the windows were a little foggy. There was a small porch with 2 old chairs and a metal bucket by the steps. Behind the cabin, the woods continued endlessly. I turned off my car and got out. The silence hit me immediately. There were no cars, no people, no sound of wind. Only a distant, dull hum of insects somewhere in the trees. I carried my things inside. The place smelled of wood and something slightly damp. The floor creaked under every step. There was a small bed against one wall, a table, a single chair, and a narrow window facing the trees. The bathroom was basic, the kitchen small, with an old gas stove and a kettle. Everything seemed fine at first. Simple and quiet, exactly what I wanted. That first evening was calm. I made tea, sat on the porch, and watched the sky turn orange. The forest grew darker and thicker as night came. The air felt different there. It was heavier, colder. When it got too dark, I went inside and switched on the single light bulb hanging from the ceiling. It flickered slightly but worked. I remember standing there, feeling strange about the silence. In the city, you always hear something: cars, people, distant noises. Here, there was nothing. The only sound came from my own breathing and the occasional creak of the cabin walls. I went to bed early that night. The mattress was hard, and I could feel every spring beneath me. It took a while to fall asleep, but eventually I did. Sometime later, I woke up suddenly. There was no clear reason why. I lay there in the dark, listening. The cabin was completely silent. I thought maybe I heard something outside, like a faint crunch. I stayed still for several minutes, waiting, but heard nothing else. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or deer, and fell back asleep. The next morning, I woke up to light spilling through the window. It was colder than I expected. When I stepped outside, I saw mist hovering between the trees, thick and white. It made the forest look endless. I boiled water and had instant coffee while sitting on the porch. Everything felt calm again, though I couldn't shake off the uneasy feeling from the night before. Later that day, I decided to explore the area around the cabin. I followed a small path that started behind it. It led deeper into the forest. The ground was soft with layers of old leaves and branches. I walked for a long time, maybe an hour, before realizing how quiet everything was. No birds, no wind, just still air and the crunch of my steps. It made me feel small, like the forest didn't even notice me. After a while, I came across a clearing where the trees opened up to a small patch of dead grass. There was something strange there. Pieces of wood arranged in a rough square shape, almost like the remains of an old foundation. It looked like there might have been another cabin there long ago, but it had rotted away. The ground around it was uneven and dark in spots, like it had been burned once. I didn't stay long. Something about that place felt wrong, like I shouldn't be standing there. When I returned to my cabin, it was late afternoon. The light coming through the trees was golden and weak. I noticed something odd near the porch, a footprint in the dirt. It wasn't mine. It was larger, and the shape was slightly off, like someone had stepped there with heavy boots. I crouched down and looked closely. The print was fresh. I could still see the edges clearly. I looked around but saw nothing else. Maybe it was from a hiker or someone from the nearby properties. Still, I hadn't seen a single car or person since I arrived. That night, I couldn't sleep easily. I kept hearing small noises, wood shifting, faint thuds outside, and something like slow steps in the distance. Every time I thought about getting up to look out the window, I froze. I told myself again that it was just the forest. Animals move around at night, but I couldn't shake the thought that the print near my porch was human. By the third day, I started feeling uneasy all the time. The silence no longer felt peaceful. It felt like something was waiting just beyond it. I spent most of the day sitting inside, reading an old magazine I had brought. Around noon, I went outside to get some air. That's when I noticed something else. The footprint from the day before was gone. The dirt had been disturbed, like someone had stepped over it or brushed it away. The air felt heavy that day. The forest didn't move. Not a single leaf swayed. I tried to distract myself by cleaning the cabin a little, but the unease kept crawling up inside me. Around evening, I saw something at the edge of the trees. At first, I thought it was just a tree trunk, but when I looked again, it seemed like a dark shape standing there. It was far too far to make out clearly. I blinked and it was gone. That night, I stayed awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. I heard noises again, more distinct this time. Steps on the porch, slow and careful. My heart started pounding so hard I thought whoever was out there could hear it. The steps moved across the boards and then stopped. I waited. Nothing. I couldn't bring myself to look out the window. I lay still for almost an hour before I finally heard the faint sound of retreating steps fading into the woods. When daylight came, I went outside. The porch had faint marks on it, small bits of dirt, like someone had walked across. There were no clear footprints this time, but I knew what I had heard. I started wondering if maybe someone else used this cabin when it wasn't rented out. Maybe a hunter or a local. Maybe they didn't know I was staying here. I wanted to leave, but I had no phone service, and the road back was long and rough. I told myself I'd wait one more night, then leave early the next morning. That evening, I packed most of my things and kept my car keys close. I tried to sleep, but I couldn't. Around midnight, I heard it again. Steps, faint but steady, moving slowly around the cabin. My whole body froze. I listened carefully. The steps circled, crunching on dry leaves, then moved closer to the walls. I could hear soft sounds, like someone brushing against the wood. I didn't move. I just lay there, breathing shallow, staring at the dark ceiling. After several minutes, I heard the porch creak. Then silence. Total silence. I didn't sleep after that. I just waited for the first light. At dawn, I went outside. The air was cold, my hands shaking. I checked the ground around the cabin. There were prints this time, clear ones. They led from the woods to the porch and then around the cabin, stopping near the back window. I looked closer at the prints. They were definitely from boots. I followed them a few steps into the forest, but they stopped suddenly, like whoever made them had turned and gone deeper between the trees. I couldn't see where they went after that. I decided I wasn't staying another minute. I threw the rest of my things into the car, started the engine, and drove off down that long dirt road. My heart was pounding the whole way, waiting to see something in the rearview mirror. But there was nothing, just trees and empty road. When I reached the main road, I finally pulled over to breathe. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the wheel. I told myself it was probably just some local wandering around, maybe curious, but something about it didn't feel that simple. For some reason, I couldn't stop thinking about the old foundation I'd seen in the clearing. The burned ground, the shape of that dark patch, kept coming back to me. A few days later, when I was back home, I tried to find more information about that cabin. The listing disappeared from the website. I searched the location name and found nothing. Finally, after digging through some old maps online, I found a small mention of an old logging camp in that area, abandoned decades ago after a fire destroyed part of it. No details, just that several workers had gone missing and the site was left empty. The cabin I stayed in wasn't listed on any newer map. It wasn't part of any official rental registry either. I never figured out who had posted that listing or who had been out there in the woods at night. But I still remember the sound of those careful, slow steps circling the walls and the silence that came after. Sometimes I think about how quiet it was when I first arrived, how peaceful it felt. Now I know that kind of silence doesn't mean peace. Sometimes it means something is already there, waiting, watching, and you just haven't noticed yet. I never went back to any cabin after that. Even now, years later, when I see pictures of wooden cabins deep in the woods, part of me feels that same tightness in my chest. The kind that reminds you what it feels like to lie still in the dark, waiting for something to pass by your window, hoping it doesn't stop. And every time I think of silence, I remember that place, how it held its breath at night, how the forest never moved, how the air felt like it was listening. I remember those prints and the way they stopped right at my back window, facing in. I had planned the trip for months, telling myself it would be the kind of escape I desperately needed. My life had become a blur of work, traffic, and constant noise, and I craved silence, solitude, and space. The cabin I rented was deep in the mountains, far from any town, road, or neighbor. Its location promised isolation. A small wooden structure hidden among thick pine and fir, accessible only by a narrow dirt track that wound up the mountainside. I thought it would be perfect. I thought it would be peaceful. I thought I would be safe. The first day was ordinary. The drive up the winding dirt road was long, my car crawling over uneven rocks and loose soil. The trees closed in on both sides, tall and dark, their trunks heavy with moss, branches swaying in a cold wind that carried the faint smell of wet earth. When I finally reached the clearing where the cabin sat, I felt a sense of relief that was almost physical. The cabin itself was rustic but sturdy, built from thick logs with a tin roof and small, dark windows. A thin trail of smoke rose from the chimney, which made it seem like it had been recently used, though no one was there when I arrived. I spent the afternoon unpacking. The interior smelled faintly of wood polish and dust, a clean but slightly stale scent. The walls were lined with shelves and hooks for tools and supplies, the furniture simple but functional. There was a small kitchen area, a stone fireplace, and a lofted sleeping space with a mattress and blankets. I lit the fireplace, and the warmth spread through the cabin slowly but surely. The first night, I sat on a chair near the fire, sipping instant coffee, listening to the wind and the sound of the trees. The forest felt alive, but not menacing, just quiet, lonely, and still. It was the second night that things started to feel wrong. I had gone out earlier that day to explore a little. The trees grew denser, and the ground became uneven with roots and rocks. I wandered down a faint trail that led to a small creek, the water running cold and clear over smooth stones. On the way back, I realized I had walked farther than I intended, losing track of time and direction. When I finally returned to the cabin, the sun was low, the shadows long and thick. I told myself it was fine, that this was what I had wanted, solitude and the challenge of being self-reliant. But that night, after the fire burned down to embers, I heard it. At first, it was faint, a sound like footsteps on dry leaves outside the cabin. I froze, listening. The cabin was old, and creaking noises from the wood were normal, but this was different. It was deliberate. Step, pause, step, pause. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was an animal. Deer, raccoons, something larger. I told myself the forest was full of wildlife. Still, I kept a small hunting knife close by and stayed near the fireplace, listening. The footsteps didn't stop. Occasionally, there was a scraping sound against the side of the cabin, like someone dragging a heavy object. My chest tightened. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was alone, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of someone or something moving deliberately around the cabin. I stayed awake for hours, the fire's glow flickering across the walls. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I slept lightly, waking at odd intervals to check the windows and doors. Nothing. No signs of anyone. The next morning, I decided to check the perimeter. I walked carefully around the cabin, scanning the thick undergrowth, listening for broken branches or footprints. There was nothing. The forest was empty, quiet, normal. But when I reached the far side, near the small creek that ran behind the cabin, I noticed something odd. There were footprints, human footprints, leading from the edge of the trees to the back of the cabin, wet and muddy from the morning dew. They were large, irregular, and clearly recent. My stomach dropped. They did not circle back into the forest. They stopped at the cabin. I rushed back inside, my hands trembling. I checked the doors and windows. Everything was closed, everything locked. Nothing had been moved, but the footprints were real. Someone had been here. Someone had been walking around the cabin while I slept. The thought made my blood run cold. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a hiker who had wandered past. Maybe it was someone checking abandoned cabins. But the tracks were fresh, and the way they ended at the cabin made it clear whoever had made them had come too close for comfort. I spent the day preparing. I reinforced the doors, checked the windows, and made sure the fireplace tools were within reach. I gathered extra wood, sharpened my knife, and kept a heavy stick nearby. I stayed alert, listening constantly. The forest seemed quieter than before, as if it too was holding its breath. That night, the footsteps returned. I could hear them circling the cabin, slow and deliberate. At one point, there was a knock, a single loud bang against the side of the cabin. I jumped, heart hammering. It was then I realized I was completely alone, completely unprotected, and completely visible to someone who knew exactly where I was. Panic set in. I considered leaving, but the car was half a mile down the rough trail, and darkness made the forest treacherous. If I tried to run, I could trip, sprain an ankle, or worse. I had to survive the night. I stayed in the loft, out of sight from the windows, clutching the knife. I could hear breathing outside, faint, slow, deliberate. Time stretched, minutes dragging into hours. Every small sound made me flinch. The wind shifting, a branch snapping, the faint scraping of something against the cabin's walls. I imagined someone could be hiding just beyond the trees, watching, waiting. By morning, the presence had vanished. The forest was quiet, and the footsteps were gone. I forced myself to move, checking the exterior. There were no signs of forced entry, no damage, nothing except the faint impression of footprints in the mud around the cabin. Whoever it was, they hadn't come inside. But I knew they had been close enough to touch the walls, to see me. The realization was terrifying. I felt trapped, exposed, and extremely vulnerable. I spent the next day cautiously exploring further from the cabin, marking trails and noting landmarks, thinking I needed a safe route to escape if needed. I realized the isolation I had sought could quickly become a trap. The forest that felt peaceful at first now seemed hostile, full of shadows and possibilities. Every rustle of leaves, every distant bird call, every broken twig made my heart jump. I had learned the hard way that solitude could be dangerous. The following night was the most harrowing. The footsteps returned, louder this time, circling the cabin in a slow rhythm. The banging on the walls came again, sharp and deliberate. I stayed in the loft, shaking, listening. The presence was patient, methodical. Hours passed. I was exhausted, cold, terrified, and yet I dared not move. At dawn, I realized I could not stay. The risk of leaving at night was too great, but staying meant more terror. I had to find a way out safely, and I had to be strategic. I packed essential supplies, food, water, warm clothes, and my knife, and waited until the sun was fully up. Then, I left quietly, following the trail I had marked. I moved quickly, staying low, watching the edges of the forest. I imagined someone could still be following me, hiding, waiting. I kept to the narrow dirt road that led to my car, moving as silently as possible. Every sound seemed amplified, the crunch of gravel, the distant caw of a bird, the rustle of leaves in the wind. I refused to look back. By the time I reached the car, my hands were raw from gripping the knife. My legs ached from moving quickly through the rough terrain. and my mind was numb from fear. The car was exactly where I had left it. I opened the door, climbed in, and locked it immediately. My relief was overwhelming. I started the engine, the vibrations and hum of the motor oddly comforting. As I drove down the dirt road, I glanced at the forest on either side, dense, silent, and dark. I knew I had been lucky. Whoever had been there had chosen not to confront me directly. I didn't know why. I didn't know how. But I was alive and I was leaving. I didn't return to the cabin. I drove straight to the nearest town, reporting what I could to the local authorities. They noted that the area had occasional trespassers and hikers, but nothing unusual in recent reports. I realized they would not fully understand what I had experienced, and that was fine. I did not want validation. I wanted safety, and for the first time in 2 nights, I felt it. That night, I booked a motel in town, away from forests, trails, or isolation. The simple fact of being among other people, hearing normal traffic, seeing lights, and feeling locks and security measures around me brought an immense sense of relief. I knew I would not forget the fear, the sound of footsteps circling my cabin in the dead of night, the vulnerability of being completely alone in the wilderness. It took months to process the experience fully, but I learned something important. Isolation could be beautiful, but it could also be dangerous. Nature had no malice, but people did, and sometimes there was no warning. The cabin, the forest, and the silence had offered peace and danger in equal measure. I survived, not because of luck alone, but because I remained alert, cautious, and determined to leave when the risk became clear. I never returned to the cabin, and I never underestimated the presence of others in the wilderness again. Even now, years later, I think about that trip. The memory of that night in the loft, the sound of footsteps, the quiet patience of someone watching, stays with me. It is a reminder that fear is not always imagined. Sometimes it is real, and survival depends on respect for that reality, preparation, and the courage to act when it matters most. I never sought isolation again, and I learned to value the presence of other people, safety, and awareness above all else. The forest is still out there. The cabin is still hidden in the trees. But I am far away, and I am alive. I remember everything, down to the smallest detail, the smell of damp earth, the feel of the cold metal of the knife in my hand, the creak of the cabin boards under unseen weight, and the raw, aching relief of leaving. The experience left scars, yes, but it also left a clarity I will never forget. Life is fragile, danger is real, and the wilderness hides many things we cannot control. I drove up the narrow dirt road late that Friday afternoon, the tires crunching over gravel as the mountain air grew colder and thinner with each turn. The road twisted between tall pine trees that blocked out most of the sky, and the only sound besides the engine was the steady hum of wind pushing through the branches. I had rented the cabin for a long weekend, wanting peace and quiet away from work, phones, and people. The listing had said it was deeply secluded, and that was exactly what I wanted. Total silence, no signal, and no one for miles. By the time I reached the small clearing where the cabin stood, the sun was already falling behind the ridge. The last bit of orange light hit the slanted roof, and for a moment, everything looked peaceful. The simple wooden porch, the dark windows, the smoke pipe on top, the tall trees circling it like walls. It looked old but sturdy. I parked near the edge of the clearing and stepped out, hearing nothing but the wind and my own footsteps on the gravel. The air smelled of sap and damp earth. There were no other cabins around, no lights in the distance, nothing that even looked like a road leading farther up. It felt like the world had ended somewhere below the hill, and this cabin was the only thing left standing. When I went inside, the air was cold and still. The floor creaked under me. It smelled faintly of wood smoke and old fabric, like no one had been here for a long time. The small living room had a couch, a low table, and a brick fireplace with a few logs stacked beside it. The kitchen was part of the same space, small and simple. A counter, a sink, a propane stove, and some old cupboards that rattled when I opened them. There was a single bedroom with a narrow bed and one window that looked out toward the trees. I unpacked my bag slowly, taking my time, feeling that quiet weight of being completely alone settle in. My phone had already lost signal halfway up the mountain, and even though I'd expected that, the silence that came with it still felt strange. There was no hum of traffic, no faint voices, not even the sound of a plane, only wind. After lighting the wood stove, I sat near it and watched the flames catch. The warmth spread slowly through the cabin, and for the first time all week, I felt relaxed. The tension of city noise and schedules seemed far away. I ate a simple meal I'd brought with me, drank water from a jug, and watched the last bit of light fade outside. When darkness finally covered everything, I noticed how deep it was. It wasn't the kind of dark you find in a city or even a small town. This was complete. No glow from streetlights, no sky reflection, just blackness pressing against the windows. I turned off the lantern and sat in the dark for a while, just listening. The woods were alive in a different way at night. I could hear branches moving, small cracks, the sound of something shifting through leaves now and then. It didn't sound close, but it reminded me that I wasn't really alone here. There were animals everywhere, deer, raccoons, maybe even a bear. I went to bed early that night, the wood stove giving off a steady low heat. The bed was firm but comfortable, and I fell asleep faster than I expected. When I woke up, it was still dark. I didn't know what time it was, but I could tell something had pulled me out of sleep. I lay there listening, eyes open, trying to adjust to the faint outline of the window. Then I heard it, a soft creak, slow and deliberate, somewhere from the living room. Not like the random pops of wood contracting in the cold, but a footstep. I stayed still, barely breathing. Another creak came, then nothing, just wind again. I told myself it was the wood settling or maybe a raccoon on the porch, but I could feel my pulse in my throat. After a few minutes, I sat up and grabbed the flashlight from my bag. The beam cut through the dark, showing the corner of the room, the door, and the floor. Everything looked normal. I forced myself to check the living room. The wood stove had gone out, and the air was cold again. The door was still locked, the windows shut tight. There was no sign of anything. I went back to bed, but didn't fall asleep again for a long time. The next morning, the sun came through the trees in long, cold stripes of light. I made coffee on the stove and sat outside on the porch, watching mist drift between the trunks. Everything looked so calm that it made the night before feel ridiculous. I tried to brush it off, old cabin sounds, imagination, whatever. Still, I noticed small things that made me uneasy. The cabin door had a faint mark near the lock, like a scratch or a scrape that hadn't been there the night before. The ground near the porch had footprints, but they looked like mine, maybe from when I arrived. I tried not to overthink it. I decided to hike down the small trail behind the cabin. It led down into the trees and curved along a stream that I could hear but not see. The air was damp and full of pine needles, and the only sounds were water, wind, and my own footsteps. I walked for an hour before turning back, feeling calmer, like the woods had swallowed all the anxious thoughts from the night. When I got back, I noticed something subtle. The curtain in the bedroom was pulled halfway open. I was sure I had closed it earlier. The air inside also felt colder, like the door had been open for a bit. I checked the locks again. Everything was in place, but that uneasiness returned, quiet but constant. That night, I made a fire in the stove early, trying to keep the cabin warmer. I read a book under the dim lantern light until my eyes grew tired. Before lying down, I double-checked the door and windows again, then got into bed. It must have been sometime after midnight when I woke up again. This time it was quieter than before. No wind, no creaks, no forest sounds, just total silence. That silence was somehow worse. It felt like the air itself was holding its breath. I sat up slowly. My flashlight was beside me again. I turned it on and aimed it toward the door. Nothing moved. Then I noticed something that made my chest tighten. The faint smell of cold air coming from the living room. The stove was out, but the air smelled fresh, like outside air. I got up, my hands shaking slightly, and moved toward the main room. The door was shut, but the metal latch wasn't set. I was certain I'd locked it. The lock itself was still in place, but the latch above it had been moved. I didn't know what to do at that moment. There was no phone signal, no one nearby. The nearest small town was at least an hour's drive down the mountain. I checked the windows again, found them still closed. Nothing else looked disturbed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been inside. I barely slept after that. In the morning, I found fresh footprints in the dirt near the side of the cabin. They were faint but clear enough, not mine. They came from the tree line and stopped near the wall, where they turned back again. I stood there for a long time just staring at them. They looked like normal boots, not animal prints, not anything strange, just human. That day I kept busy. I chopped firewood from the pile beside the shed, boiled water, and walked the perimeter of the cabin like I was checking a fence. I didn't want to admit how uneasy I was getting. Every sound made me turn my head. Even the rustle of leaves sounded too deliberate. By late afternoon, clouds were building over the ridge. The air got colder again, and a light rain started. I decided to stay inside for the rest of the evening. The sound of rain on the roof was constant, heavy enough to drown out smaller noises. I tried to read again, but my mind kept replaying the footprints and the open latch. As the night deepened, I noticed how the rain seemed to slow down, then stop entirely. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. I turned off the lantern and sat still, just listening. That's when I heard it again, the faint crunch of gravel near the porch. One slow step, then another. I froze, heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Whoever it was, they were outside. I could hear the sound of the porch boards creaking under a slow, deliberate weight. I waited, barely breathing. Then the sound stopped. I didn't move for nearly 10 minutes. The air felt thick. I knew that if I turned on the light or opened the door, I'd be exposing myself completely. I just stayed still. After a long time, the sound didn't return. Eventually, exhaustion won over fear. When I woke again, it was dawn. The porch was wet, the ground soft from the rain. But there were new footprints, clear ones, heavier than before, right up to the door. I followed them with my eyes. They came from the trees, circled the cabin once, and disappeared back into the woods. I decided that morning that I'd leave early. I didn't want to spend another night there. I started packing my things, trying not to look outside too often. But before I left, something made me pause. A small object on the windowsill. It was a folded piece of paper, weathered and damp from the rain, like it had been slipped under the window somehow. My stomach dropped as I picked it up. It wasn't written in a threatening way, just a single line in rough handwriting. "You shouldn't be here." That was enough. I threw my bag in the truck, started the engine, and didn't look back as I drove down that winding road. The forest felt different now. Not quiet, but watchful, like it had eyes hidden behind every trunk. The road took nearly an hour to reach the bottom, and when I finally saw the first stretch of paved highway, I felt the first real breath of relief in 2 days. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest gas station in the valley, where I parked under bright fluorescent lights and just sat there. I called the cabin owner later that day when I got signal. They said no one else had access to the property. They even sounded surprised that I'd mentioned footprints. They told me maybe it was hikers or hunters, maybe someone passing through. I didn't argue. A few days later, out of curiosity or maybe guilt for leaving early, I looked up the cabin listing again. It was still there, same photos, same description. But when I looked closely at one of the pictures, the one of the living room, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. In the reflection of the window, half hidden behind the glass, there was the faint outline of a figure. Not a ghostly blur, just a real person's shape, head, shoulders, standing outside, looking in. It wasn't something you'd notice unless you zoomed in. But now that I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. That night, back in my apartment, I couldn't sleep. The quiet didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt like the same silence from the cabin, the kind that comes before a noise you can't explain. I kept thinking about that one sentence, "You shouldn't be here." For a long time, I tried to convince myself that it was just a drifter, someone living off the grid nearby, maybe using the woods for shelter. Maybe they didn't want anyone finding out. Maybe they watched that cabin to make sure no one stayed too long. But part of me still wonders how many nights that person stood outside the window while I was asleep, and how long they'd been there before I ever arrived. I rented the cabin because I wanted peace. That's really all I wanted. I was tired of the noise in the city, the traffic, the constant movement. I'd been working long hours, barely sleeping, and I thought a few weeks alone in a quiet place would help clear my head. I found the listing online. A small wooden cabin deep in a mountain valley, about 4 hours from the nearest town. The photos showed a calm stream behind it, pine trees all around, and a big deck overlooking the valley. It looked perfect. When I arrived, it was even quieter than I expected. The air felt heavier there, colder too, even though it was early autumn. The dirt road leading up to the cabin was narrow, and my tires kicked up dust the whole way. When I pulled up, I could hear nothing but the sound of the wind moving through the trees. No people, no cars, no planes overhead. Just the sound of my own engine as I turned it off and sat there for a moment, looking at the cabin. It was smaller than it looked online. The wood was darker and older. The porch sagged slightly in the middle. The windows were dusty. It didn't look abandoned, but it didn't look well kept either. I carried my bags inside and noticed the smell right away. A faint scent of damp wood and dust, like the place had been closed up too long. Still, it was quiet, and that's what I came for. There was a single main room, kitchen, table, couch, and a small wood stove. The bedroom was off to the side, with a single bed and a narrow closet. The bathroom was tiny. It had no running water except from a hand pump that pulled from a nearby well. No Wi-Fi. Barely any cell signal. Felt like another world. The first day was peaceful. I unpacked, opened the windows to let the air move through, and sat outside on the porch for hours. I watched the trees shift in the wind and listened to the sound of the stream behind the cabin. I felt calm for the first time in months. That night, the quiet hit me harder. It's strange how silence can make you hear things you'd normally ignore. I could hear every creak of the cabin as it cooled down. I could hear the branches scraping the roof when the wind picked up. I could even hear tiny movements in the walls, probably mice or something. Still, I told myself that's normal in old cabins. I fell asleep early that night, and sometime after midnight, I woke up. It was completely dark. My phone screen said 12:48 a.m. I didn't know why I woke up at first. Then I heard something faint outside. It sounded like a footstep on dry leaves. Just one. Then silence again. I stayed still for a long time, staring at the ceiling, listening. The only other sound was the faint whistle of the wind coming through the cracks in the window frame. I told myself it was probably an animal. Deer, raccoons, anything. I eventually fell asleep again. The next morning, I walked around outside with my coffee. The air was cold, and my breath came out white. I looked at the ground near the porch and saw a few spots where the dirt looked disturbed. Could have been my own footprints from unloading the car the day before. I didn't think much of it. I spent most of that day chopping wood and exploring the trail behind the cabin. It wound down the hill toward the stream and then split into two. One path went along the water, the other climbed up toward a ridge. I followed the ridge trail for a while until I came to a clearing that gave a wide view of the valley. From there, I could see my cabin down below, the little roof half hidden in the trees. It looked peaceful from that distance. I stayed out there until late afternoon and then went back down. When I returned, I noticed the cabin door was slightly open, not wide, just a few inches. I stopped walking and stared at it for a moment. I was sure I had shut it that morning. The latch wasn't strong, and maybe the wind had pushed it. I went inside slowly, half expecting to see something moved, but everything looked the same. My bags were where I left them, the wood stove cold, the windows closed. Still, the air felt different. It had that slightly stirred up feeling like someone had been moving around. That night, I couldn't relax. I kept glancing at the window. Every sound outside felt sharper, closer. Around 10 p.m., I decided to double-check the doors and windows, making sure they were all shut tight. I even slid a chair under the door handle just in case. I laughed at myself for doing it, but it made me feel better. At around 2 a.m., I woke again. This time it was the sound that woke me. A soft scraping against the wall, low to the ground. It went on for a few seconds, then stopped. Then it started again, slower, like someone dragging something across the wood siding. My heart was pounding. I sat up and held my breath. After a few minutes, it stopped completely. I waited, staring at the dark window until my eyes hurt. I didn't move until sunrise. When the light came, I went outside immediately. I walked around the cabin and looked at the wall where I thought the sound came from. I saw faint marks on the wood, vertical scratches. Not deep, but enough to notice. They were too high to be from an animal like a raccoon. They looked like they'd been made with something hard, maybe metal. I walked farther around the cabin and saw something else. Footprints. Not shoe prints exactly, just faint outlines in the dirt that looked human. Barefoot, maybe. The toes weren't clear, but they were about the size of a man's foot. I stood there for a long time, staring at the ground. I kept telling myself it could have been old, maybe from a hiker who passed by. But the prints looked fresh. The dirt was still slightly loose where they'd been made. I didn't want to overthink it, so I decided to stay closer to the cabin that day. I read a book, kept the fire going, and tried not to look at the windows too much. Later that afternoon, I went to the stream to fill some water containers. The water there was freezing cold, running fast over smooth rocks. As I bent down to fill the first jug, I noticed something across the water, a shape between the trees. It looked like an old tent, faded green, half collapsed, maybe 100 feet away on the other bank. I stared at it for a long time, but I couldn't see any movement. I thought maybe someone had camped there long ago and left it. Still, it made my chest feel tight. I didn't go closer. That night, the noises came back. Not just scraping this time. I heard faint thumps, like something bumping against the wall, and once I thought I heard the porch boards creak. I stayed still in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening. My throat was dry. The air felt too quiet between the sounds. Then it stopped again, and the silence after was worse than the noise. In the morning, I found the door latch slightly bent, not broken but pulled outward just a little. Enough that I had to push hard to close it again. I didn't know what to think. I hadn't seen anyone since I arrived. No hikers, no rangers, no cars on the road. It was just me out there. I decided I'd leave the next day. I could finish my stay early and drive back to town. That afternoon, I packed some things into the car. I wanted to be ready to leave early in the morning. As I was doing that, I noticed something strange. My folding knife, the one I'd left on the porch table, was gone. I looked around everywhere, under the chair, inside the cabin, near the woodpile, but it was nowhere. That was the moment the fear really sank in. Someone had to be coming near the cabin at night. I didn't know if they were just messing with me or waiting for something worse. That evening, I locked the door again, blocked it with the chair, and turned off all the lights. I sat in the dark on the bed, holding the only other knife I had, a kitchen one. I waited, barely moving, trying to listen through the sound of my heartbeat. Around 1 a.m., I heard it again, slow footsteps outside. Not running, not sneaking, just walking. The steps went along the side of the cabin and stopped near the porch. Then came a long pause. The silence was so deep it felt like my ears were ringing. Then the porch creaked softly. The footsteps moved closer to the door, stopped, and then I heard the faintest sound of metal against wood. It was the latch being tested. My chest felt like it was going to explode. I didn't move or breathe. After a minute, I heard the footsteps again. Slower now, moving toward the back of the cabin. Then nothing. The silence went on for so long I started to doubt I'd heard it at all. I stayed awake until the first light came through the window. I walked outside the second I could see clearly. The grass was wet with dew, and the air was cold enough to sting my throat. I checked around the cabin and saw more footprints, clearer this time. They circled the cabin, stopping at the porch and the back wall. And near the back, I saw something else. My missing knife, stuck upright into the ground. The blade was dirty, the handle wet. I pulled it out and wiped it with my sleeve. That was it for me. I went inside, packed everything I could fit into my car, and didn't even bother to clean up. As I was loading the last bag, I felt that strange feeling again, the sense of being watched. I turned toward the trees and scanned the edge of the forest. For a second, I thought I saw something move. A figure stepping behind a tree, far away but just visible enough to know it wasn't my imagination. I got in the car and started it without looking back. The tires spun in the dirt, throwing up dust as I backed down the narrow road. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely hold the steering wheel. I didn't stop until I reached the highway miles away. When I got back to town, I called the rental owner to tell him something was wrong with the property. He said nobody had been up there in months. No neighbors nearby either, just forest for miles. He sounded surprised when I told him about the footprints and the noises, but he didn't have much to say after that. I didn't go back. I left a few things behind in that cabin, clothes, tools, a book or two, but I didn't care. A week later, I checked the listing again out of curiosity, but it was gone, completely taken down. Sometimes I still think about that place. The sound of the stream, the cold air, the quiet that I thought would help me. I think about how someone might still be there, moving through the trees, watching the road, waiting for the next person to come for peace and quiet. I haven't been able to sleep in total silence since. Even in my apartment now, I keep some noise going, a fan, a radio, anything. Silence feels like it's listening. I had been planning this trip for months. It wasn't the kind of vacation that involved beaches, restaurants, or crowded cities. I wanted isolation, silence, and the chance to escape the constant hum of everyday life. A small cabin tucked deep in the woods had caught my attention online. Its photos promising solitude, dense trees, and the quietest environment I could imagine. It was a 2-story wooden structure, surrounded by pine and oak, with a small creek nearby. No neighbors for miles, no Wi-Fi, no cell reception. Exactly what I needed. I arrived in the late afternoon, the sun low enough to make the forest glow orange, but not so low that it was dark. The gravel road leading to the cabin was narrow, twisting through thick woods. The tires crunched against loose stones, echoing far into the trees. Every so often, I caught glimpses of deer moving away into the underbrush, their eyes reflecting the last rays of sunlight. The air was crisp, carrying a faint smell of pine, earth, and moisture from the creek. The cabin itself looked smaller than the photos had suggested, but it had a sturdy, well-worn charm. The wood had weathered to a soft gray, and moss crept along the edges of the roof. There was a small porch with a swing that swayed slightly in the breeze. I parked my car beside the cabin, took a deep breath, and carried my backpack inside. The interior was simple. A living area with a wood stove, a small kitchen with basic supplies, and a staircase leading to 2 upstairs bedrooms. The furniture was sparse but functional, and the cabin smelled faintly of wood polish and something older, a mixture of dust and damp that spoke of years spent mostly empty. I spent the next hour unpacking, setting up my sleeping area, and preparing firewood. There was a stack beside the stove, chopped neatly and ready. I could hear the creek running nearby, its constant murmur a comforting background sound. As the sun sank lower, the forest began to darken, and shadows stretched across the cabin walls. I made a mental note of all the exits and windows. The cabin had 1 main door, a back door, and 4 windows on the ground floor, all with sturdy locks. Upstairs, the windows were slightly smaller, and I could see the forest stretching endlessly beyond them. By the time I sat down to eat, the sun had disappeared entirely, leaving a dull, gray twilight. I had brought a small lantern, and I lit it, setting it on the kitchen counter. Its warm glow was the only source of light, casting long shadows across the room. Outside, the forest was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves. Birds had gone to roost, and even the wind seemed to have slowed. I told myself it was normal. The woods were alive in ways that made city life feel foreign. Still, there was a tension in the air, a kind of alertness I couldn't shake. I finished eating, washed my plate in cold water from the cabin sink, and decided to start a fire in the stove. The crackling of the flames soon filled the room, and the warmth was comforting. I sat in an armchair near the stove, letting my mind drift, listening to the forest. That's when I heard it, a sharp, snapping sound outside. My first thought was a branch breaking under an animal's weight, perhaps a deer or a raccoon. but the sound was deliberate, not random, and it was closer than anything I'd heard before. I stood and moved toward the window, peering out into the dark. The forest was dense, and the trees created a patchwork of shadows. First, I saw nothing. Then, movement, a figure, barely distinguishable, crouched low and moving carefully between the trees. My heart skipped a beat. It couldn't be another human. I was too far from any road or trail, yet the movement was too precise, too purposeful to be a deer. I backed away from the window, telling myself it was my imagination, that my eyes were playing tricks on me. I locked all the doors again, double-checked the windows, and sat back by the fire. I tried to focus on the warmth, the sound of the creek, anything to calm myself. Time passed slowly. I watched the shadows flicker across the walls, each one making me tense as I imagined something moving within them. Hours seemed to pass in minutes, and my mind conjured possibilities I tried to ignore. Around midnight, the sounds outside became more noticeable. Footsteps, soft but deliberate, circling the cabin. Leaves crushed under weight, twigs snapping. I could hear breathing, shallow and controlled. My pulse raced. I had no phone reception, no way to call for help. The nearest house was miles away, hidden behind thick forest and hills. I grabbed a heavy cast iron pan from the kitchen and held it like a weapon, moving from window to keep watch. Then the sound of the back door handle rattling froze me. Someone was trying to open it. My first instinct was panic. The door was sturdy, but I could hear the metallic jingle of the latch being tested. Whoever it was, they knew what they were doing. I moved to the front door, checking the locks again. The wind picked up, carrying the sounds of movement through the trees. My mind raced. If it was someone trying to break in, what could I do? I considered escaping through the back, but the darkness of the forest and the distance to the road made it suicidal. I retreated to the living room, keeping close to the stove. My breathing was shallow, my hands shaking as I gripped the pan. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Then I heard it, the faint sound of glass tapping against wood. Someone was testing the windows. My stomach turned. I needed a plan. I remembered the creek behind the cabin, where the water was deeper and faster in some places. If I could make it there, I might be able to hide, at least temporarily. But the thought of running through the forest in complete darkness, with a person outside, made me freeze in place. Hours passed, filled with the sound of movement, occasional snapping of branches, and the constant, low hum of fear in my chest. I realized that whoever was outside had not yet found a way in. Perhaps they were waiting, observing, planning. I had to remain calm, conserve energy, and be ready for anything. I moved quietly through the cabin, keeping lights low, listening for any change in the pattern of noises outside. Each sound set my nerves on edge, making me jump and hold my breath. Eventually, as the night deepened, the footsteps became less frequent. I stayed alert, sitting near the stove, the pan ready. I thought about what could have happened if I had tried to confront the person. The thought made my stomach churn. I had to survive this night, no matter what. Dawn seemed impossibly far away, yet it was the only chance I had to see clearly and plan my escape. As the first hints of light filtered through the trees, I could finally see the forest in faint gray. The air was damp, and the night had left a heavy mist over the ground. I peered out of a window, careful not to make sudden movements. There was no one there, no footprints, no disturbance, only the forest returning to its natural state. My body was tense, exhausted from hours of fear, but I knew I had survived the worst. I spent the day preparing. I gathered extra firewood, reinforced the doors and windows with heavy furniture, and kept my backpack ready. I stayed alert, listening for any signs of the person returning. That night, I kept the stove burning and the pan close, but the hours passed with fewer sounds. Each shadow and movement made me flinch, but I remained in control, refusing to let panic take over. By the third day, I realized that I needed to leave. I had survived, but the cabin was no longer safe. I packed quickly, checked all the locks, and left no trace of my presence inside. I walked carefully through the forest, keeping to areas where I could see the road. The sun was rising, and I moved faster, adrenaline keeping me alert. After hours, I reached the gravel road, the sight of my car a relief beyond words. Driving away, I looked back at the cabin. It was silent, peaceful, but I knew what had happened there. Something or someone had been watching me, testing me, and I had survived only through careful observation, preparation, and restraint. The forest was beautiful, but it was also dangerous, and isolation came with risks that city life never showed. That trip changed the way I approached wilderness. I became meticulous in preparation, aware of every sound and shadow, never taking solitude for granted. The cabin was no longer just a destination. It was a memory of survival, of fear faced and endured. I never returned, and I never stayed in a place without communication again. But even now, months later, the memory of footsteps outside the cabin in the night, the snapping of branches, and the deliberate, patient presence of something unknown in the darkness haunts me. I had been planning the trip for months, wanting nothing more than to escape the noise of the city, the constant demands of work, and the endless scrolling on screens. I found a small cabin for rent deep in the mountains, far from the nearest town, a place where cell service was almost non-existent and where the closest neighbor was miles away. The pictures online promised a rustic, wooden cabin surrounded by thick forest, a perfect place to disconnect. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sun hanging low over the ridges, casting long shadows across the winding dirt road that led to the cabin. The drive had been exhausting, with narrow turns and uneven gravel, but the sense of isolation excited me. The cabin was exactly as advertised. A single-story structure made of weathered logs, with a steep roof that looked like it could handle the heaviest snow, and a small porch with a creaky railing. I parked the car beside it and took a long breath, the scent of pine and damp earth filling my lungs. Inside, it was simple but comfortable. A small kitchen, a living area with a stone fireplace, a bedroom with a single bed, and a bathroom that looked functional but had the faint smell of mildew. I unpacked my things quickly, eager to explore the surrounding woods before it got dark. The forest around the cabin was dense and uneven, a mix of pines and oaks, with undergrowth that made walking difficult. I followed a narrow trail for a few minutes, enjoying the crunch of dry leaves beneath my boots, the occasional bird call, and the distant sound of a stream. The sun dipped lower, and the shadows stretched across the trees, turning the woods into a place that felt alive in a way I couldn't explain. I told myself it was just my imagination, the way isolation and quietness made everything seem more intense. Eventually, I turned back to the cabin, feeling a strange mix of exhilaration and unease. I lit the fireplace and settled into a chair with a small notebook and a pen, intending to write. The fire crackled and popped, casting flickering shadows across the walls. Outside, the wind rustled through the branches, making the cabin groan and shiver. It was a normal sound, but in that silence, it became unsettling. I heard something else too, a faint scraping like nails dragging across wood, from somewhere beyond the porch. I froze, straining to hear. The sound stopped, but my heart was racing. I convinced myself it must have been a branch brushing against the railing, or maybe a small animal. Night fell quickly. The forest outside became an impenetrable wall of black, and I realized that the only light came from the fireplace and a small lantern I had brought. I decided to make dinner, cooking a simple meal on the tiny stove, but every noise outside made me tense. The scraping returned, this time closer, and then I heard another sound, footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. I stopped everything, holding my breath, listening. They were heavy, not the light steps of an animal. They moved to the far side of the cabin, then paused. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. I grabbed a flashlight and edged to the front door, peeking outside. Nothing. The moon was hidden by clouds, and the trees swayed in the wind. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. I debated calling the police, but I had almost no cell service, and the nearest town was over 30 miles away. I realized I was completely alone, with no one to help me if someone intended harm. I went back inside and locked all the doors and windows, checking each one carefully. The cabin was old, and some locks were weak, but I did what I could. I decided to stay alert, keeping the flashlight in my hand and moving from room to room, listening for any sound. Hours passed, the night stretching endlessly. Occasionally, I heard scratching, scraping, the faintest shuffle that made me freeze in place. I tried to rationalize it. Animals, wind, the old cabin settling, but deep down I knew there was something else out there. Sleep became impossible. I sat by the fireplace, the shadows dancing across the walls, my mind spinning with every possible scenario. I imagined someone watching from the woods, waiting for the right moment. I thought about the stories you hear in the news about hikers or cabin renters being attacked, and I realized how unprepared I was. I had a small pocket knife, but no real protection. My heart pounded with fear, and yet I couldn't leave in the dark. The car was parked 100 feet away, unprotected and exposed. Around 2 in the morning, I heard a loud crash at the back of the cabin. Something heavy had hit the wall, and I could see splintered wood through the gaps in the logs. I grabbed the flashlight and cautiously went toward the noise, holding the knife in front of me. The back door was intact, but the window beside it was cracked. Outside, I saw footprints in the mud leading toward the woods, large, uneven, and human. I realized someone had been here, watching, waiting. I didn't know if they had seen me or if they intended to come back. Panic surged, but I forced myself to stay calm. I decided to prepare the cabin defensively. I moved the furniture to block doors, stacked heavy chairs against windows, and made a small weapon from a kitchen knife and a broom handle. I also grabbed my phone and kept it near the window, hoping for a signal to call the police. The night stretched on like a test of endurance. Every sound made me jump. The wind, a falling branch, even the distant howl of a coyote. I couldn't sleep, couldn't relax, and every minute felt like an hour. At dawn, the footsteps returned, slower this time. I watched from behind the barricade of furniture, breathing quietly. A man appeared at the edge of the woods, moving cautiously, as if he were looking for something. He was dressed in dark clothes and he carried a backpack. He walked around the cabin, examining it, then crouched briefly to look through the cracked window. I could see him clearly now, and I realized he was alone, like me, but his intentions were unknown. I waited, heart hammering, and when he finally moved away toward the woods again, I seized the moment. I ran to the car, keeping low and moving quickly, starting the engine and driving off before he could react. The road was rough, the tires crunching on gravel, but adrenaline pushed me forward. I didn't look back until I reached the main road, where cell service returned. I called the local police and reported everything: the broken window, the footprints, the man who had been watching the cabin. They said they would investigate, but I didn't wait to hear more. I drove straight to the nearest town, exhausted and shaken. Days later, the police called. They had found the man nearby, living in an abandoned cabin hidden in the woods. He had a history of stalking remote renters, watching them from a distance, and sometimes breaking in when they weren't paying attention. No one had been injured yet, but the officers confirmed it could have been much worse if I hadn't noticed the footprints and acted quickly. I never went back to the cabin. The experience stayed with me, not as a supernatural story, but as a real and terrifying reminder of how vulnerable isolation can make you. I had survived because I stayed alert, because I took the situation seriously, and because I acted decisively. Months later, I could still remember the sound of the scraping at the windows, the cold shadow of someone moving just beyond my vision, and the fear that had made every second feel endless. The lesson was clear, and I carried it with me. Nature and solitude can be peaceful, but isolation also makes you exposed. Being prepared, cautious, and aware can mean the difference between a harmless trip and a situation that could cost you your life. I learned that in the woods, danger doesn't need to be supernatural. It can be human, real, and frighteningly close. And sometimes, surviving means trusting your instincts, moving fast, and never underestimating the shadows around you. I never forgot the cabin, the forest, or the night I spent trapped inside it with someone watching. It changed the way I thought about being alone, about trust, and about the importance of being ready for anything. The fear I felt wasn't a story to tell for thrills. It was a warning that still guides my decisions today. And for all the months I spent recovering from the memory, I eventually found a way to live with it, knowing that I had survived something terrifying, real, and entirely human. I had always believed I could handle being alone in the wilderness. There was a quiet pride in the thought, a sense of self-sufficiency I liked to imagine I possessed. The cabin I rented was deep in the mountains, tucked away beside a frozen lake that reflected the towering pines like a mirror. The road to get there was narrow and rough, barely more than a track through the forest, and the GPS on my phone frequently lost signal. That was exactly what I wanted, distance from everything. No people, no noise, no distractions. I wanted nothing but the cold, the trees, and the silence. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sky pale and slanting with the last light of day. The cabin itself was small but solid, built from thick logs and stone. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, though I knew it wasn't from a recent fire. I carried my pack inside, noting the smell of dust and old wood mingled with faint hints of pine resin. The floorboards creaked under my weight. The windows were thick with grime, filtering the light into a greenish haze. Inside, it was sparsely furnished. A wooden table, 2 chairs, a small bed, and a stove that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in months. A stack of firewood sat near the stove, neatly chopped, as if someone had intended for me to use it. I dropped my pack and pulled off my boots, noticing the echo of every movement in the quiet cabin. The walls were bare, save for a few nails and hooks that might have held tools or pictures at some point. I started a fire in the stove. The first few sparks struggled to catch, but soon the wood began to burn, filling the cabin with a warm glow. Outside, the wind had begun to pick up, rustling the pine needles and sending a chill through the cracks in the log walls. I moved around the cabin, inspecting every corner. The kitchen area was small, with a single shelf holding a few cans of food and a rusty kettle. There was a small sink with a hand pump, which I assumed drew water from a nearby well or stream. Everything seemed functional, if slightly neglected. As night fell, I prepared a simple meal. The wind howled outside, making the thin walls shiver, and I felt the first stirrings of unease. It wasn't fear, exactly, just a creeping awareness that I was alone. The isolation felt thicker here than in any city apartment or suburban home. The darkness outside was complete. I could hear the trees groaning, the distant crash of a branch breaking, the rustle of something moving through the underbrush. I reminded myself it was nothing. Bears, deer, the wind. Simple explanations. I went to bed early, exhausted from the drive and the hike through the final mile of forest. The mattress was firm and scratchy, the blanket heavy and coarse. I lay down, the fire's glow fading as it burned low, and I listened to the night. Hours passed. Somewhere, far off but close enough to hear, there was a repeated thump, faint at first, then louder, as if something was stepping carefully along the edge of the clearing. My heartbeat quickened. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a bear. I tried to fall asleep, but the sound persisted, irregular and deliberate. By the time I had convinced myself to get up and check, I could see nothing outside the small windows. The wind had shifted, and the sound had stopped. My stomach was tight with tension. I filled a kettle with water and set it on the stove, telling myself the noise was gone. The whistle of steam seemed unnaturally loud in the otherwise quiet cabin. I paced for a while, inspecting the locks on the door and the shutters on the windows. Everything was secure. The thought of someone being out there watching was irrational, yet I couldn't shake it. Sleep finally claimed me, but it was restless and punctuated by dreams of being surrounded in the forest, branches snapping under invisible weight, shadows moving just beyond my vision. When I woke, the cabin was quiet again, bathed in early morning light that filtered through the grime on the windows. I got up and stoked the fire, noticing footprints in the snow outside the cabin door. My stomach sank. They were fresh, human-sized, and they led straight to the edge of the trees. I tried to convince myself it was just someone else in the area, maybe another hiker or a hunter. Still, I had not seen a single person on the way up, and the area was so remote that encountering another human felt unlikely. I took a deep breath and decided to focus on practicalities. I packed a small day pack with essentials: water, food, a flashlight, a hatchet, a pocket knife, and stepped outside to survey the area. The footprints stopped at the tree line, as if whoever had made them vanished into the forest. The rest of the day was tense but uneventful. I tried to relax, chopping wood for the fire, gathering water from the nearby stream, cooking a simple meal. The isolation was oppressive now, pressing in with every gust of wind. I found myself constantly scanning the tree line, every shadow making me flinch. The sun began to set, and the temperature dropped sharply. I built a larger fire in the stove and sat close to it, trying to quell the creeping fear in my mind. Night came again, colder and darker than before. The wind had picked up into a full storm, rattling the roof and shaking the windows. I lay in bed, wrapped tightly in blankets, listening. Around midnight, the noise began again. Footsteps in the snow outside, slow, measured, circling the cabin. My heart raced, and I realized that no animal could make such deliberate steps. Someone was out there. The rational part of my mind screamed to stay calm, but panic rose in my chest. I thought of calling the authorities, but my phone had no signal. Hours passed. The footsteps stopped. I dozed fitfully, waking at intervals to check the windows. When I looked out, the snow was pristine again, as if no one had been there. I told myself I was imagining it. Exhausted, I forced sleep, but at dawn, I discovered something that froze my blood. The firewood I had stacked neatly the night before was scattered across the floor. Marks on the ground suggested it had been tipped deliberately, not accidentally. I stayed tense all morning, keeping a hatchet close and listening for any sound. I tried to rationalize again. Maybe the wind had knocked the wood over, but I knew the marks on the floor didn't match that. I decided to leave, packing my bag and preparing to hike down the trail. The path, however, was blocked. Snow and debris had shifted in the storm, covering the trail in places and leaving others treacherous. I realized I couldn't leave easily without risking serious injury. The next day, I tried to keep busy, chopping wood, reinforcing the cabin doors, and scouting around the perimeter. That night, I was more prepared. I set up makeshift barriers by stacking heavy furniture against the doors and windows. The footsteps returned around midnight, circling slowly, and this time I was ready. I moved silently to the window with my flashlight and scanned the clearing. Shadows shifted between the trees. For the first time, I saw a figure, crouched low, watching the cabin. I didn't hesitate. I threw a pot from the stove at the window, shattering it, and yelled as loudly as I could. The figure jumped back, startled, disappearing into the woods. I bolted out the back door, running across the snow-covered clearing to the nearest ridge that gave a clear view of the surrounding forest. I knew that staying in the cabin meant risking another encounter. From the ridge, I could see the nearest dirt road winding through the trees, maybe a mile or so away. I started walking toward it, moving carefully but quickly through the deep snow. My legs burned, my lungs ached, and I was terrified the figure might still be following me. Hours passed as I trudged through the forest, exhausted, cold, and numb with fear. Eventually, I broke through the trees and saw the road, deserted but solid beneath my feet. I followed it downhill, leaving the wilderness behind. At last, I saw headlights in the distance. Relief washed over me. I waved frantically until the car slowed and stopped. A couple in a small SUV rolled down their windows, concern written on their faces. I explained my situation as best I could, and they insisted on driving me to the nearest town, where I could contact the authorities. In the days that followed, the police scoured the area around the cabin. They found tracks indicating someone had been living near the cabin for some time, hiding in the forest, watching, and possibly breaking in on previous occasions. There were signs that the intruder had survived off small game and scavenged supplies, moving in silence to avoid detection. No one was ever caught. The experience left me shaken but also strangely empowered. I realized just how careful I needed to be in the wilderness, how much respect isolation demanded, and how quickly fear could sharpen instincts. I never returned to that cabin, and I never stayed alone in such remote locations again. But I also knew that I had survived something real, something tangible, something human. And in the end, survival, preparation, and the will to move forward were the only things that mattered. Even now, I can picture the forest, the cabin, and the figure crouched just beyond the trees. I can feel the cold snow under my boots, the wind slicing my face, the isolation pressing down like a weight. And I am grateful I made it out alive, that I could return to civilization and tell the story, clear and complete, without any fantastical embellishments, without ghosts, without luck. Just the raw, terrifying reality of being alone, and facing someone else who was watching me, waiting, patient, and relentless. I had been driving all day, my eyes burning from the constant glare of the sun and the highway stretching endlessly in front of me. The GPS had finally led me to a narrow dirt road winding into the woods, and I knew I was close to the cabin I had rented. It was supposed to be a weekend of peace, an escape from everything. The city noise, the endless obligations, the constant weight of work. I wanted nothing more than the solitude of the forest, the quiet crackle of a fire, the smell of pine and wet earth. The cabin itself was small, built of weathered logs, with a pitched roof and a tiny porch that creaked under my weight as I stepped out of the car. The forest around it was thick, tall pines stretching high, their tops barely visible in the fading light. There was no cell phone signal, no sign of neighbors, nothing but the soft rustle of the wind and the occasional distant cry of a bird. I felt a strange mix of relief and unease. Relief at being away from everything, unease because the isolation was so absolute. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of wood smoke and damp. Dust lay thick in the corners, and cobwebs hung in the ceiling beams. I unpacked my things slowly, making sure to check every room. The main room had a small fireplace, a kitchen corner with a stove, and a single bed in the far corner. The windows were thick, old glass with streaks of dirt, making the forest outside appear like a dark, swaying shadow. After setting up, I built a small fire in the fireplace, the smoke curling lazily up the chimney. The cabin filled with a warm, orange glow, and for a moment, I felt safe. But as night fell, the sounds outside changed. The wind rustled the trees differently. Every snap of a branch, every distant crack of falling wood, sounded louder, closer, sharper. I tried to tell myself it was normal, wildlife moving at night, the forest settling, but the feeling in my stomach tightened. Around midnight, I had gone to check the windows before bed. I noticed something strange, a faint trail in the dirt around the back of the cabin, barely visible in the moonlight. It wasn't a deer trail. It was too straight, too deliberate. I frowned and stepped closer, but there was nothing else, no footprints leading up to the cabin. My mind tried to rationalize it. Maybe a hiker had passed by earlier, maybe it had rained and blurred the tracks. Still, the thought lingered. Sleep came reluctantly, and I woke several times to noises. Something scraping against the side of the cabin, the occasional thump like a heavy branch falling too close to the walls. Each time, I forced myself to stay calm, reminding myself of the isolation and that the nearest person was miles away. The next day, I decided to explore the area. I walked along the dirt path that led deeper into the forest, carrying only a small backpack with water and a flashlight. The sun was high, and the forest was alive with birds and insects, but there was a strange stillness that I couldn't ignore. I noticed more signs: disturbed underbrush, broken twigs, places where the soil had been pressed down unnaturally. I felt like I was being watched. The thought made my skin crawl. When I returned to the cabin, I noticed my car seemed slightly out of place. Not moved exactly, but somehow shifted. The thought of someone having been here while I was gone sent a spike of panic through me. I checked the doors and windows. All were locked. There was no sign of forced entry. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, I slept fitfully, waking to every creak and groan of the cabin settling. Around 2 a.m., I woke to a sound that froze me. A slow, deliberate tapping on the side of the cabin. Not random, not accidental. Someone or something was outside. My heart pounded. I stayed very still, listening. The tapping stopped. I didn't move for what felt like hours, waiting for any sign of movement outside. Morning brought no relief. I stayed inside, pacing, trying to plan my next steps. I had thought about leaving, driving back down the dirt road, but the road itself was long, winding, and unfamiliar. I needed daylight, and I needed to be careful. The thought of encountering whoever or whatever had been outside in the night was terrifying. As the day dragged on, I noticed more subtle signs. Small items I had placed in the cabin had been slightly moved. Nothing major, nothing I could point to definitively, but enough to make me feel unsettled. I began barricading doors and windows as best I could, moving furniture to block entry points, creating a sense of safety in a place that no longer felt safe. By late afternoon, I decided I needed to get more supplies. I left the cabin cautiously, moving quickly down the dirt road toward the nearest small town, my eyes scanning the trees constantly. Every sound made me jump. I felt like I was being followed, although I couldn't see anyone. When I reached the edge of the forest, I finally saw the dirt trail again, the same straight, deliberate path I had noticed the night before. My heart sank. Someone had been tracking me. I made it to the town and bought extra food, water, and a few basic tools, flashlights, a small hatchet, and pepper spray. I tried to calm myself, reasoning that the town was safe, and I would return to the cabin only if necessary. I spent the night in a motel, keeping the lights on and doors locked, unable to sleep properly because my mind kept replaying the tapping, the footprints, the subtle movement inside the cabin. The next morning, I returned to the cabin cautiously during broad daylight. Everything appeared normal at first glance, but then I noticed fresh tire tracks in the dirt near the back, leading into the forest and back toward the cabin. Whoever had been there wasn't gone. They had returned while I was away. I felt sick to my stomach, but forced myself to investigate carefully. I found small signs that someone had attempted to enter the cabin more aggressively during my absence. Slight scratches on the wooden frame of a back window, footprints in the soft dirt outside the front porch. I knew I had to act. This was no longer a vacation. I set up a system to alert me to any movement. Cans tied with strings around the perimeter, some of the broken furniture in front of doors, flashlights strategically placed so that a beam would catch anyone attempting entry. I also moved my car slightly off the main dirt path, hiding it behind a thicket of trees. Every step I took was cautious, every noise amplified in my mind. That night, the tapping returned. Louder, more insistent. My heart raced as I realized the intruder had found the cabin again. I stayed low in the corner, flashlight ready, hatchet within reach. The sound circled the cabin, moving deliberately from wall to wall. At some point, the intruder seemed to pause directly outside the main door. I froze, breath shallow, listening. Then I heard the scrape of metal, the doorknob being tested. I waited. I didn't scream, I didn't move. Minutes passed like hours. Eventually, the sound receded into the trees. I waited for another long while before daring to look outside. The dirt trail was empty. No footprints except those I had made. The intruder had left, at least for now, but I knew it was temporary. Determined to end this, I spent the next morning carefully examining the surrounding area. I traced the tracks in the dirt deeper into the forest. The path was narrow but clear. Someone had been moving around, watching, perhaps even studying the cabin's structure. I decided I could no longer stay alone. I called the local sheriff's office from my motel, explaining the situation calmly and clearly. I couldn't explain everything, I didn't want to sound hysterical, but I described the tracks, the signs of attempted entry, the persistent tapping and noises. They agreed to send a deputy to inspect the cabin and patrol the area. When the deputy arrived, we drove to the cabin together. He examined the perimeter, the doors, and the windows. He noted the tracks and signs of intrusion, confirming that someone had been around recently. He promised to increase patrols and advised me not to return alone, at least until the person was identified. After the deputy left, I returned to the town, arranging for the cabin to be secured and monitored. I rented a small cabin closer to the town for the remaining days of my vacation. I still felt the tension, the awareness that someone had been so close, watching, moving silently in the woods. But at least I was safe now, in a place where help was nearby, where I wasn't completely isolated. In the following weeks, I learned that there had been reports of someone trespassing in the forest cabins in that region, though the person had never been caught. I realized that I had been extremely lucky, not just in surviving, but in noticing the subtle signs, in staying calm, in seeking help. The experience left me with a heightened sense of awareness, a wariness I hadn't had before, but also a deep appreciation for the safety of being near other people, even if just a few miles away. I never returned to that original cabin. The image of the dark forest, the tapping, the tracks, and the silent presence outside the walls stayed with me for months. But I also learned to trust my instincts, to notice small changes, and to act decisively when something felt wrong. And in the end, that awareness, the ability to respond, to survive, was what allowed me to escape the situation safely, alive, and with a sense of control restored. I had been planning this cabin trip for months. The work had been unbearable, and the constant city noise made my head ache. I needed solitude, a place where I could be alone with my thoughts, and the remote cabin I found on a small website seemed perfect. It was advertised as isolated, deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town. The pictures showed a sturdy wooden structure, with a stone fireplace, a small porch, and thick trees surrounding it. I imagined myself waking up to birdsong and the smell of pine, writing in my notebook, and spending the evenings by the fire. The drive out was long and quiet. I watched the city gradually shrink behind me, replaced by winding roads, patches of dense forest, and stretches of empty land. The air felt cleaner, and I could smell the faint scent of wet earth after a morning rain. By the time I arrived, the sun was already low, casting long shadows between the trees. The cabin looked exactly like the photos, maybe even better in person. Its wooden exterior was weathered but solid, and the surrounding forest seemed both peaceful and protective. I spent the first hour unpacking. My backpack contained food, water, notebooks, a small stove, and basic supplies. I lit the fireplace, feeling a comforting warmth immediately fill the room. The cabin was small but functional, with one main living area, a tiny kitchen, and a loft bedroom. I moved slowly, taking in every detail: the scratches on the wooden floor, the small stack of firewood in the corner, the way the sunlight filtered through the grime-streaked windows. I felt a strange sense of contentment. This was exactly what I had wanted. Night fell faster than I expected. The sun disappeared behind the thick canopy, and darkness settled over the cabin. I ate a simple dinner and sat in front of the fire, listening to the wind rustle through the trees. The silence outside was almost complete, broken only by occasional bird calls or the distant rustle of leaves. I felt completely alone, and for a while that was comforting. I read for a bit, then wrote in my notebook, documenting my trip, my thoughts, my feelings. I noticed how quiet everything was, how the outside world felt far away and almost unreal. It was late when I went to bed. I set my alarm for the next morning, thinking I would wake early and hike around the area. I felt safe, but there was a subtle unease I couldn't shake. The forest outside seemed too still, the shadows too deep. I told myself it was just my imagination, the way darkness always makes small noises seem larger. I woke in the middle of the night to a strange noise. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible. A soft scratching, coming from outside the cabin. I froze, listening. The sound came again, louder this time, like someone dragging something across the wooden porch. My heart started to race. I reminded myself that it could be an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. I tried to calm down, imagining the fire would keep me safe. But the noise didn't stop. It grew more deliberate, moving closer to the cabin. I realized then that the scratching wasn't random. It was purposeful. Something or someone was out there, circling the building. My mind raced. I had no way to call for help. There was no cell signal in this area. The nearest town was miles away. I could stay quiet, I could hide, but what if whoever or whatever was decided to try the doors or windows? I grabbed a heavy iron poker from the fireplace and moved silently to the bedroom loft. From there, I could see the front porch through a small window. My stomach churned when I saw a shadow move across it. Someone was standing there, just out of the reach of the firelight. I couldn't make out any details, but I could feel their presence, a stillness that pressed against the glass. My instincts screamed at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. The forest surrounded the cabin on all sides, dense and dark. I decided to wait. I sat in the loft, heart hammering, gripping the poker, listening. The figure moved again, slow and deliberate. Then it stopped. Minutes passed. My mind jumped between possibilities. Was it a lost hiker? A trespasser? Someone with bad intentions? I knew I couldn't stay in the loft forever. I had to find a way to get help or escape if needed. Morning never seemed to come. The darkness stretched endlessly, broken only by the flickering firelight. Exhausted and terrified, I finally forced myself to climb down and check the perimeter. I peeked outside carefully, keeping low. The porch was empty. No footprints, no signs of someone having been there, just leaves disturbed by the wind. I felt relief, but it was shallow. I knew I hadn't imagined the shadow. Something had been there, and it was gone now, but where? I spent the next day cautiously inspecting the cabin. I checked all windows and doors, reinforcing locks with nails from the supply box. I also collected a stack of firewood, thinking I might need it for defense or to create more light. I kept the fire burning constantly, knowing it made me feel safer. Still, every crack of a branch or rustle in the trees made me flinch. By the second night, my nerves were frayed. I couldn't sleep, constantly listening for movement outside. Around midnight, I heard it again, the soft, deliberate scratch of something moving along the wooden porch. I grabbed the poker and held it tightly. I reminded myself I needed to stay calm, that panicking would do nothing. This time, the figure appeared at the window. I saw the faint outline of a person, crouched low, watching me. Fear froze me in place. My mind raced for options. I remembered the small trail at the back of the cabin, leading into the forest. If I could reach it, I might be able to get to the road or at least put distance between myself and whoever was out there. I waited for the figure to move again, then bolted for the back door. I ran as fast as I could into the trees, the dark swallowing me. I didn't look back, just kept running, dodging roots and branches, trying to find the trail. After what felt like hours, my lungs burned. I was covered in scratches, but I finally stumbled onto the narrow dirt path. I followed it, hoping it led to the road. Eventually, I heard the faint hum of a car engine. I ran toward it, waving my arms frantically. A man in a pickup truck slowed down, staring at me in surprise. I screamed for help, pointing to the cabin. He didn't ask questions. He opened the passenger door and I jumped in. The truck roared down the dirt road, leaving the cabin and forest behind. Later, I learned the truth. The cabin had been recently targeted by a group of thieves who were using it to scout for valuables. They had broken in on several occasions when it was advertised as empty. I had unknowingly arrived just after they had returned, explaining the shadow and the noises. I realized how lucky I had been. Their plan had been interrupted by my presence, and I had escaped because I acted quickly. The experience stayed with me for months. I couldn't stop thinking about how close I had come to being trapped, how vulnerable isolation can make a person, and how easily the forest's quiet can turn threatening. I sold the cabin trip knowing I would never return. But I also felt a strange sense of gratitude. I survived by staying calm, thinking ahead, and trusting my instincts. It was terrifying, but in the end, I made it out alive, and I knew exactly how dangerous it could have been if I hadn't. I learned that the wilderness is beautiful but unpredictable. Solitude is precious but can turn into peril if one isn't careful. That cabin, with its peaceful exterior, had almost become a trap, and I knew I would never underestimate isolation again. I now plan trips only to places with communication and safety measures. The experience was harrowing, but it taught me the value of preparation, awareness, and quick thinking. In the end, I survived, and the relief of that survival has stayed with me longer than any fear. That night, the sounds returned. This time, they were more deliberate, closer, louder. Someone was outside, moving around the cabin. I could hear the faint scrape of a shoe on the wooden porch. My heart pounded. I grabbed the heavy iron poker from the fireplace, keeping it close, and I stayed in the loft, trying to listen. The sound of the steps circled the cabin slowly, almost methodically. Whoever it was, they were not just passing by. They were examining the cabin, maybe trying to find a way in. I debated calling the police, but cell service was weak. I couldn't rely on being able to reach anyone quickly. Panic mixed with a sense of caution. I needed to think carefully. Hours passed like this. The steps stopped at intervals and then started again. I stayed crouched, clutching the poker, my eyes scanning the shadows outside the small window. Eventually, I noticed that the footsteps moved toward the woods, fading into the distance. I didn't breathe fully until I realized they were gone. I stayed awake until dawn, listening to ensure there was no return. When the first light broke through the trees, I climbed down and checked the perimeter. Everything was as it should be, no signs of entry, no footprints around the cabin other than my own. I tried to calm myself with the daylight again, though the unease lingered. Something had been outside, I was certain, and I had no idea why or what they wanted. The following day, I stayed on high alert. I moved through the cabin with deliberate caution, checking locks and windows repeatedly. I set up makeshift alarms using cans and string along the porch edges. I explored farther into the forest, careful to mark my path and maintain a clear line back to the cabin. I collected more firewood and even fashioned some wooden stakes to defend myself if necessary. The anxiety was exhausting, but I felt empowered in a way, preparing for whatever might happen. I realized the isolation that had once seemed peaceful now carried a weight, a responsibility to protect myself because there was no one else around. I slept less that night, keeping the fire burning and the poker close. The tension continued over the next day and night. Each sound in the forest made my heart jump. I began to notice patterns in the way shadows moved, the way the wind rustled branches. I realized the forest itself could mask any movement, and anyone skilled could approach without being noticed. The reality of isolation hit me hard. I could not rely on anyone but myself. That knowledge was terrifying but also clarifying. I understood that fear was not just from imagination. It was based on the genuine vulnerability of being alone in a vast, unpredictable environment. By the third night, I felt the strain physically and mentally. My muscles ached from constant tension. My mind raced constantly, and my sleep was shallow and fitful. Then, on the fourth day, I heard something different. Not footsteps, but voices. Faint, muffled, almost carried by the wind. I froze, straining to identify them. There were at least two voices speaking in low tones. I moved quietly to the small window and tried to peer into the dense forest. Shadows moved, but I couldn't see clearly. I realized then that I had been lucky. The people outside were not ordinary hikers or hunters. They were scouting, maybe searching for something or someone. Fear surged. I had to act carefully. I returned to the cabin and began gathering supplies quickly. Food, water, and anything I could carry. I didn't want to confront them. I didn't want to hide indefinitely. I needed a plan to get back to civilization safely. I packed what I could into my backpack and left a note inside the cabin, explaining my departure, in case someone eventually came looking for me. I climbed into the car and started the engine, though I kept it quiet. The voices seemed to linger, and shadows moved through the trees as if they were aware of me. I waited, tense, observing the forest, until I was confident I could move without being seen. Then I drove slowly down the dirt road, ready to backtrack toward the main road I had come in on. My hands were shaking on the wheel, my mind alert for any signs of movement. I knew the forest could hide people easily, but I also knew that staying put was far more dangerous. The drive back to the main road was tense and slow. Every rustle of leaves, every branch breaking made me flinch. I kept the car's lights low to avoid drawing attention. Hours passed, and finally, I reached a paved road. Relief washed over me like a wave. I stopped at the first gas station I saw and called the police. I reported what had happened, explaining the strange presence at the cabin, the voices, and the deliberate movements. They told me they would send someone to check, though I was skeptical about how quickly they could respond. I bought some food and rested, letting the tension drain out of me gradually. For the first time in days, I felt a sense of safety. Weeks later, I received a call from the police. They had investigated the cabin and surrounding forest. There were signs of trespassers. Someone had been moving through the area deliberately, leaving faint tracks and disturbing underbrush, but they had left no evidence of confrontation. The area had been used by a small group for illegal activity, though exactly what they were doing remained unclear. They confirmed that my instincts had been right. I had been in danger. The knowledge was chilling, but it also validated everything I had felt during those long, tense nights. In the end, the experience left me changed. I understood isolation in a way I never had before. I realized the forest was not simply beautiful or peaceful. It was alive with danger, subtle and patient, and that human presence could turn it into something threatening in moments. But I also realized my own resilience. I survived because I stayed aware, because I prepared, and because I trusted my instincts. I no longer romanticized solitude in the same way. It could be beautiful, yes, but it could also be dangerous in ways that were not obvious until you were alone and unprotected. I returned to the city with a deeper understanding of myself and the world around me. The cabin, the forest, and the nights I spent there haunted my memory, but not in the way of fear alone. They haunted me with lessons about vigilance, survival, and the quiet strength I discovered within myself. I had been planning this trip for months. It wasn't supposed to be anything extraordinary, just a few days alone in a cabin I had rented in the dense woods of northern Montana. I had been craving isolation, away from the city, from people, from the constant hum of everything. The cabin itself was rustic but solid, built in the 1970s with thick logs and a stone chimney. The road that led there was rough and narrow, lined with tall pine trees, and I had to drive slowly, navigating deep ruts and mud puddles. By the time I arrived, it was late afternoon, and the sun was already starting its slow descent behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The first thing I noticed as I stepped out of the car was the absolute silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the heavy, almost oppressive kind. There was no wind, no rustle of leaves, no distant bird calls. Just a deep, waiting quiet that pressed against my ears. The cabin itself looked welcoming at first glance, with smoke curling from the chimney and the faint smell of wood and old pine inside. I unlocked the door and stepped in. The inside was dimly lit by a single window, and the air smelled faintly of dust and musty carpets. There was a small kitchen, a living area with a sofa and a worn rug, and a lofted bedroom with a simple bed. I unpacked my bag, laying out some clothes and food. I had brought a small cooler, a camping stove, some canned food, and a lot of water. There was a woodpile stacked neatly outside, so I knew I could make a fire if needed. I set about lighting the fireplace, trying to make the room feel warmer, more lived in. As the first logs caught, the room filled with the sharp, clean smell of burning wood. The sound of the crackling fire was comforting, almost hypnotic, but even with it, the silence outside the cabin seemed too thick, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I spent the first few hours just walking around the cabin, checking windows, doors, and locks. Everything seemed secure, yet I had a strange sensation that I wasn't alone, even though I knew I was. I tried to shake it off as nerves, or maybe my mind playing tricks in the dim light. By late evening, I cooked a simple dinner, ate slowly, and then settled in front of the fire, reading a book. The shadows of the flames danced across the walls, making familiar shapes look unfamiliar. Outside, the darkness was complete. The trees merged into a solid wall of black, and the sky was full of stars, glittering coldly. As the night deepened, I felt a small thrill of unease. It started as a feeling in my stomach, a tightness that wouldn't go away. Then I began noticing little things. A faint creak from the floorboards upstairs, the occasional snap of a twig far off in the woods, and the constant, low hum of something just beyond my sight. I tried to reason it out. The cabin was old. The woods were alive with animals, maybe a deer or a raccoon or a bird. But still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was moving just out of view, watching. Around midnight, I decided to check the windows. The moon was almost full, and the silvery light revealed the outlines of the forest. Nothing was there. I took deep breaths and returned to bed, but sleep was hard. Every rustle, every creak, made me sit up and stare into the dark corners of the room. I forced myself to drift off eventually, lulled by the sound of the fire and the slow, steady rhythm of my own breathing. I woke before dawn, startled by a loud bang against the cabin wall. My heart jumped into my throat. I scrambled out of bed and peered through the window. Nothing. The woods were empty, still, but now the sound of my own heartbeat was deafening. I tried to rationalize it. A falling branch, maybe, or a rock. But it didn't feel right. My skin crawled, and I realized that I hadn't felt this alone in a long time. I spent the next day on edge. Every small noise made me tense. The wind brushing against the roof, the distant call of a bird, the soft, scuffing sound of something moving outside. I decided to stay inside as much as possible, but eventually, I needed water. I grabbed my boots and coat and stepped outside, telling myself I was being paranoid. The forest was beautiful in the morning light, bright and green, but still, I couldn't shake the sensation of eyes on me. I moved quickly to the stream I had passed on the way in. The water was icy but clear, and I filled my bottles as fast as I could. I noticed broken branches and fresh tracks in the mud. They were small, maybe deer, but they weren't right. They seemed too deliberate, too fresh, too close to the cabin. I returned quickly, my senses on high alert. That night, I kept the fire roaring and stacked wood around the windows, just in case. The sound of the forest was different now, sharper, closer. Couldn't sleep. Around 2 a.m., I heard a slow, deliberate tapping on the cabin door. I froze. My first thought was that it was some animal, but the rhythm was too even, too measured. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. The tapping stopped. Then, after a long silence, it started again. This time, I grabbed a large kitchen knife and held it close. I pressed myself against the wall, waiting, listening. The tapping ceased, replaced by a dragging sound outside, heavy and deliberate. My stomach churned. I stayed like that until sunrise, the first light filtering in through the windows and making the cabin feel a little less suffocating. The next day, I couldn't stay still. I had to do something. I walked the perimeter of the cabin, checking for signs of forced entry, for anything that might explain the night's events. The ground was disturbed, flattened in places, as if someone or something had lain there. There were no footprints leading away from the cabin, which didn't make sense. Whoever had been there had vanished without a trace. Panic started creeping in. I felt cornered, watched, and I realized just how isolated I truly was. There was no cell phone service, no neighbors for miles. If something happened, I was completely on my own. That afternoon, I decided to prepare for the worst. I barricaded the doors with furniture, reinforced the windows as best I could, and sharpened my knives. I filled buckets with water and stacked firewood near the hearth. I even checked the loft, making sure there was a clear escape route through the small attic hatch that led to the roof. I slept little that night, listening to every noise, straining to make out the difference between an animal and something else. The next few days were tense. Every night, the noises grew closer, more precise. Branches snapped deliberately. The sound of footsteps circled the cabin, and occasionally, I saw fleeting movement in the trees. During the day, the forest seemed normal, calm even, but I couldn't relax. I was constantly checking the windows, the doors, the surrounding area. Every day felt longer than the last, and I began rationing food and water, knowing that staying put was safer than risking a trip into the woods. On the 5th night, I noticed something different. There was a faint glow near the edge of the tree line. At first, I thought it was a reflection of the moon, but it moved, subtle and deliberate. I realized someone had been outside, watching, waiting for the dark to mask their presence. My fear intensified, but so did my resolve. I had to get out. I couldn't stay trapped, waiting for an unknown threat to make the first move. The next morning, I packed a small bag with essential supplies: water, food, matches, a knife, and a flashlight. I moved quietly, staying low, and when the sun was at its highest, I made my break. The woods were thick, and I had to navigate carefully, leaving no clear trail behind me. Every step was calculated. Every sound made me freeze. I followed the path I had driven in on, hoping to reach my car without incident. Took hours, but I finally saw the road. Relief flooded me, but I stayed alert, scanning the tree line for any movement. The car was just as I had left it. I jumped in, locked the doors, and drove as fast as I could, glancing constantly in the rearview mirror. The forest seemed endless, but eventually, I reached a main road and then a small town. The sense of safety hit me in waves. I stopped at a gas station, called the local authorities, and reported what had happened. They were skeptical, naturally, but they promised to check the area. A week later, I returned with authorities to the cabin. What we found was disturbing. Footprints, not quite human, were etched into the soft earth, patterns that suggested someone had been moving around the cabin for days. Broken branches and shallow holes indicated attempts to dig or hide something, though nothing was found. It was clear I had been watched, studied even, but by who or what remained a mystery. The officers advised me never to return alone. I sold the cabin rental rights immediately and never looked back. Even now, months later, the memory of those nights lingers. The oppressive silence, the tapping, the dragging sound outside my window, it stays with me. I can't explain who or what was there, but I know one thing. Isolation is dangerous, and the woods can hold secrets far older and more patient than any human mind can comprehend. I tell this story not to scare anyone, but to remind myself of what I experienced. The feeling of being hunted in silence, of knowing something is just beyond reach, is real. It doesn't require ghosts or monsters. The mind itself, when alone and under pressure, can imagine horrors that are as tangible and threatening as any physical presence. But more importantly, it taught me caution, preparation, and respect for the wilderness. That cabin, those nights, and that feeling of being watched changed me forever. I am careful now. I am aware. I am not foolish, and I am grateful to be alive. It started as a plan that I thought would be simple. A solo trip to a small cabin tucked deep in the forest, far from the crowded trails and noisy campgrounds. I had been craving isolation, a chance to breathe away from the constant hum of the city, to reconnect with the quiet that I hadn't realized I had lost. The cabin I rented was modest. A single-story, wooden, perched near a small, winding river, and surrounded by thick pine and oak trees that stretched so high they blocked most of the sky. According to the rental listing, it had electricity, running water, and a wood-burning stove. Nothing fancy, nothing that promised luxury, just the basics for living and breathing in the middle of nowhere. That alone drew me to it. The drive up was long, narrow, and winding. The paved road ended miles before the cabin, replaced by gravel that bounced the car over every stone. Trees pressed close to the edges, their roots breaking through in some places, and the sound of tires crunching against loose gravel was the only noise I heard besides the occasional bird or the far-off hum of a highway miles behind. When I finally reached the cabin, the sun was beginning to lower, casting long shadows that made the forest feel enormous, stretching out in all directions. I parked, stepped out, and inhaled. There was that smell I had hoped for: damp earth, pine sap, and the faint metallic tang of the river nearby. It smelled alive, dangerous in a way I didn't yet understand. The cabin itself was simple. The front door had a lock, a small window, and the wood creaked slightly when I pushed it open. Inside, the air was musty, smelling faintly of old wood and the lingering aroma of previous visitors. Dust had settled in corners, cobwebs hung lightly from the ceiling, and the furniture was old but sturdy. There was a small table with 2 chairs, a couch with worn cushions, and a bed in a corner with a threadbare blanket. The kitchen had the basics: a small sink, a stove, some cupboards with pots and pans. I unpacked slowly, savoring the quiet, and prepared a small meal before the sun fully set. The way the cabin was positioned, the forest blocked most of the fading light, and soon it was dark enough that I needed the cabin lights. That first night was uneventful. I sat near the stove, listening to the wind move through the trees and the river rush quietly in the distance. I felt peaceful. The cabin was isolated, yes, but I felt in control. The walls were solid, the windows shut tight, and I had my supplies. When I went to bed, I slept deeply, cocooned in the quiet, alone with only my thoughts. The next morning I woke early. Mist hung low over the river, curling around the trees like smoke. I decided to explore the area, a path I had noticed during the drive that snaked through the trees and followed the river upstream. The forest was dense, and the ground uneven, covered in moss and fallen branches. I kept a careful pace, listening for birds or the sounds of animals. Everything felt normal, though I was aware of the isolation. By noon, I had walked a few miles, discovered a small clearing, and took some water from the river after filtering it. Returning to the cabin, I felt satisfied. I was alone, yes, but capable, prepared, and unharmed. The sense of safety lasted until the 3rd day. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, I noticed something odd. From the window, I could see tracks in the mud near the river, large footprints that didn't match any animal I recognized. Bear prints? Possibly. They were too large, too human-like in some ways. My first reaction was skepticism. I had been alone in the woods for days. Surely it was some trick of size or shape. But the prints continued closer to the cabin, leading toward the back where I kept my firewood stacked. My pulse quickened. I had come alone, but I wasn't entirely unprepared. I checked my phone. No signal as expected, but I had my flashlight and a small emergency kit. Still, the uncertainty gnawed at me. That night, the sounds outside were different. The forest, usually quiet save for the river and wind, seemed heavier. Twigs snapped at irregular intervals, sometimes close, sometimes far, and there was a low rustling that didn't match the wind. I stayed near the stove, firewood crackling, listening. Hours passed. Nothing appeared at first, but then I heard it clearly. A deliberate scraping noise near the cabin, coming from the back. Something or someone was moving around, just outside the walls, inspecting. I gripped a kitchen knife, my mind racing. The thought that someone could be out there, watching, testing the isolation, was terrifying. My heart thudded as I debated whether to hide, confront, or escape. I was alone. I decided to barricade the cabin. Chairs were pushed against the doors and windows, any creak of wood or step outside sending adrenaline rushing through my veins. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening. Occasionally, I heard breathing or the scrape of shoes on gravel. I didn't sleep. When the sun finally rose, I peeked cautiously outside. The tracks from the previous day were closer, circling the cabin in odd patterns. And then I saw something that froze me. Footprints leading away, but not like retreating. They were deliberate, testing the perimeter, walking close enough to mark their presence but keeping distance. Whoever or whatever was out there knew I was aware. I had planned the trip for months, a chance to escape the city and the noise and people. The cabin I found online looked perfect, remote, tucked deep in the forest, with no neighbors for miles. The idea was simple: spend a week alone, away from all distractions, just me, the woods, and my thoughts. I packed everything carefully, double-checked supplies, and drove for hours, the city disappearing behind me as the road narrowed and became rougher, lined with trees that grew closer and darker the farther I went. The last few miles were practically a dirt track, winding through dense forest, the kind of place that made me feel a little uneasy even in daylight. When I finally saw the cabin, it looked even better than in the photos. It was small, made of rough logs, with a tin roof and a porch that sagged slightly under years of use. A thin layer of moss covered parts of the roof, and the wood was weathered and gray. A fire pit sat near the porch, surrounded by stones that looked blackened from previous use. I parked my car and unloaded my bags, taking a moment to breathe in the forest air. It smelled like damp earth and pine, and there was a quiet that felt almost unnatural, like the world itself was holding its breath. The first day passed uneventfully. I explored a little, walked the small clearing around the cabin, and collected firewood. The interior was rustic but functional. A small kitchen with an old wood stove, a table with 2 chairs, a narrow bed, and a small bathroom with a shower. The place smelled faintly of mildew, but it was manageable. I set up my supplies, stacked the firewood, and made myself some dinner. Night came quickly. The forest seemed alive in ways I wasn't used to. At first, it was the normal sounds. Leaves rustling, branches creaking, owls hooting. But as darkness deepened, the noises changed. There was something heavier, slower, the kind of sound that made me sit up and listen. Something moving through the forest. I tried to tell myself it was probably a deer or some other animal, but it was different from anything I had heard before. The first night, I couldn't sleep well. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined movement outside the cabin, shadows between the trees. I would get up, look out the window, and see nothing but the darkness. The isolation started to get to me. The walls felt too thin, the trees too close, the dark too heavy. The second day, I went for a walk deeper into the forest. I wanted to see the small creek I had read about in the description. The forest was thick, the kind of place where every step is a fight against roots and brush. Birds flitted above, squirrels darted from tree to tree, but something about the quiet was unsettling. When I reached the creek, I realized how far I had gone. The sun was high, but through the canopy, the light barely reached the ground. I took a few photos, filled my water bottle, and started back, but I realized I wasn't entirely sure which way the cabin was. I stopped, trying to get my bearings. The forest looked uniform, endless in every direction. Panic started to creep in. I had a map and compass, but even following them felt wrong. The trees seemed to shift, the terrain unrecognizable. I remembered the stories I had heard about people getting lost in the forest for hours or days, and suddenly that possibility felt very real. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity, I saw the cabin in the distance. Relief washed over me, but when I got closer, I noticed something strange. The firewood I had stacked the day before was scattered, some pieces lying in the dirt, others broken in half. My heart pounded. I knew I had done that carefully. No wind or animal could have caused it this way. I brushed it off, telling myself I must have misremembered, but the uneasy feeling lingered. That night, the noises outside were worse. Something moved in the underbrush, slow, deliberate. Twigs snapped, leaves rustled. Sometimes I could hear heavy breathing, or maybe it was just the wind through the branches. I kept a kitchen knife on the table next to me, every sound making me jump. I stayed awake most of the night, staring at the windows, listening, waiting. The third day, I decided to secure the cabin as best I could. I moved heavy furniture against the doors, checked the locks, and made a small barrier at the windows. I didn't want anyone or anything coming inside. It felt extreme, but the fear was growing. I started noticing small signs that something or someone had been around. Footprints in the dirt near the porch, small broken branches, a faint smell like smoke in the air, though I hadn't seen a fire. By the fourth day, I was exhausted. The lack of sleep, combined with the constant fear, made everything worse. I stayed inside most of the day, avoiding the forest. But at night, the noises came again, closer now. I could hear something moving around the cabin, circling it, sometimes stopping. My imagination ran wild, and I imagined people, dangerous people, watching me, waiting. On the fifth day, I found evidence that terrified me. I had gone out to check the perimeter, trying to reassure myself that it was just animals, when I noticed prints in the mud leading around the cabin. They weren't deer tracks, too large, too flat. They looked human. Panic set in. I went back inside quickly and locked all the doors and windows again. I grabbed a flashlight and knife, moving from room to room, checking every corner. I felt like I was being watched constantly, the shadows outside moving with me. That night, the sound of footsteps on the porch shook me. Someone or something was out there. I stayed in the corner of the room, clutching the knife, listening. The sounds came and went, sometimes stopping for minutes, sometimes moving closer. I didn't sleep at all. The next morning, I realized I couldn't stay. I had to leave. I packed my things quickly, trying to remain calm. I checked the forest one last time, scanning for anyone who might be hiding. The forest looked empty, quiet, but the feeling of being watched was unbearable. I started the walk back to the road, keeping to paths I could remember. I moved quickly but cautiously, constantly looking over my shoulder. The forest seemed endless, each turn looking like the last. Eventually, after hours of walking, I reached the road. Relief hit me like a wave. I walked until I saw my car, parked where I had left it, untouched. Driving away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror. The forest seemed to stretch on forever. I thought I saw movement between the trees, shadows that disappeared as soon as I looked directly. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town. In town, I reported what I had experienced to the local ranger station. They took my story seriously, noting the isolation of the cabin and the possibility that someone had been using it for shelter or as a hideout. They assured me that no one had been harmed, and the area was now being monitored. Weeks later, I returned to the area with the rangers. The cabin looked abandoned. The signs of someone being there, footprints, scattered firewood, were gone, washed away by wind and rain. They confirmed that trespassers occasionally used the area but usually moved on quickly. It took months to shake the feeling of being watched, the fear that had gripped me in those days. But I learned to take precautions. Always check surroundings, trust instincts, and never underestimate the isolation of the forest. The cabin itself was just wood and nails, harmless if left alone. But in the wrong hands, or if you are alone, it could become a place of real fear. The experience changed me. I no longer take solitude lightly, no longer assume safety in familiar surroundings, and I learned to respect the quiet, the shadows, and the unknown spaces of the forest. The fear I felt was real, grounded in reality, and the lesson it left me was clear. Survival sometimes means leaving even when you want to stay. By the fourth day, I was exhausted. The lack of sleep, combined with the constant fear, made everything worse. I stayed inside most of the day, avoiding the forest. But at night, the noises came again, closer now. I could hear something moving around the cabin, circling it, sometimes stopping. My imagination ran wild, and I imagined people, dangerous people, watching me, waiting. On the fifth day, I found evidence that terrified me. I had gone out to check the perimeter, trying to reassure myself that it was just animals, when I noticed prints in the mud leading around the cabin. They weren't deer tracks, too large, too flat. They looked human. Panic set in. I went back inside quickly and locked all the doors and windows again. I grabbed a flashlight and knife, moving from room to room, checking every corner. I felt like I was being watched constantly, the shadows outside moving with me. That night, the sound of footsteps on the porch shook me. Someone or something was out there. I stayed in the corner of the room, clutching the knife, listening. The sounds came and went, sometimes stopping for minutes, sometimes moving closer. I didn't sleep at all. The next morning, I realized I couldn't stay. I had to leave. I packed my things quickly, trying to remain calm. I checked the forest one last time, scanning for anyone who might be hiding. The forest looked empty, quiet, but the feeling of being watched was unbearable. I started the walk back to the road, keeping to paths I could remember. I moved quickly but cautiously, constantly looking over my shoulder. The forest seemed endless, each turn looking like the last. Eventually, after hours of walking, I reached the road. Relief hit me like a wave. I walked until I saw my car, parked where I had left it, untouched. Driving away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror. The forest seemed to stretch on forever. I thought I saw movement between the trees, shadows that disappeared as soon as I looked directly. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town. In town, I reported what I had experienced to the local ranger station. They took my story seriously, noting the isolation of the cabin and the possibility that someone had been using it for shelter or as a hideout. They assured me that no one had been harmed, and the area was now being monitored. Weeks later, I returned to the area with the rangers. The cabin looked abandoned. The signs of someone being there, footprints, scattered firewood, were gone, washed away by wind and rain. They confirmed that trespassers occasionally used the area but usually moved on quickly. It took months to shake the feeling of being watched, the fear that had gripped me in those days. But I learned to take precautions, always check surroundings, trust instincts, and never underestimate the isolation of the forest. The cabin itself was just wood and nails, harmless if left alone. But in the wrong hands, or if you are alone, it could become a place of real fear. The experience changed me. I no longer take solitude lightly, no longer assume safety in familiar surroundings, and I learned to respect the quiet, the shadows, and the unknown spaces of the forest. The fear I felt was real, grounded in reality, and the lesson it left me was clear. Survival sometimes means leaving even when you want to stay. I had planned this trip for months, trying to find a quiet place far from the city where I could be alone, think, and escape the noise of everything around me. I didn't want people, I didn't want distractions, I didn't want anyone around to notice if I stayed silent for hours. I had chosen a cabin that I had found through an online listing, something small but isolated in the middle of the woods, with a lake nearby. It wasn't fancy, just 4 walls, a roof, a stove, and a bed. But it was far enough from any road that I knew no one would just appear out of nowhere. I packed what I thought I'd need. Food that didn't require much cooking, water, clothes for both cold nights and warm days, and some basic tools like a flashlight, a hatchet, and a first aid kit. I also brought a notebook and pens, thinking I might write while I was there, but mostly I wanted silence. The drive out was long and slow. The paved roads ended after a couple of hours, replaced by narrow gravel paths that twisted through trees and hills. The car shook, rocks hitting the undercarriage with every bump. At some point, cell service disappeared entirely. I wasn't worried. I had told a friend roughly where I'd be and when I'd return, but I didn't plan on calling anyone while I was there. I liked the idea of being cut off. The first time I saw the cabin, I realized it was even more isolated than I thought. There were no other buildings visible, just the forest stretching in every direction and a thin path down to the lake where water shimmered under the sun. The cabin itself was made of dark wood, slightly weathered but sturdy. The windows had glass, but it was a little dirty and scratched. There was a thin layer of moss on the roof, and the steps to the front door creaked under my weight. I parked the car to the side and unloaded my bag, carrying it inside. The smell hit me first: old wood, dust, and a faint dampness that spoke of years of use and little maintenance. It wasn't unpleasant, but it reminded me immediately that this place was genuinely abandoned most of the time. I spent the first hour just walking through the cabin, opening the cupboards, testing the stove, and checking the windows. The bed had a mattress but no sheets, so I unpacked the blanket I had brought. I set the water on to boil for dinner and pulled out my notebook, looking out one of the small windows toward the lake. The wind stirred the trees in a way that made the branches scrape against each other, a soft but constant sound that filled the quiet spaces inside the cabin. It was peaceful in one way, but in another, it felt like something waiting, something unseen watching the movements of the forest. I shook off the thought. It was just the woods. There was no one here. The first night came with a deep darkness I hadn't expected. The cabin had a single lamp, battery-operated, which cast a weak yellow circle across the room, leaving corners in shadow. The sounds outside became louder as the sun disappeared. The creaking of old trees, the rustling of small animals in the underbrush, and an occasional splash from the lake. Every sound seemed sharper than normal because there was nothing else to mask it. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening. Sleep was uneasy. Every little sound seemed amplified, every crack and pop of wood sending a jolt through me. I tried to remind myself that it was normal. Wood shrinks, animals move, wind blows, but it took hours before I could finally drift into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, I woke early, long before the sun had fully risen, and I went to the lake. The water was still cold, the surface smooth except for the occasional ripple when a fish broke through. Mist hung low over the water, curling around the trees at the edge of the lake. I took off my shoes and socks and let the cold water touch my feet. It was bracing, shocking even, but it made me feel alive. I stayed there a long time, just looking and listening, feeling the isolation around me. The following days fell into a slow rhythm. I cooked simple meals, chopped some firewood to keep the stove going, and walked along the paths around the cabin. I noted the tracks of animals in the dirt: deer, raccoons, maybe a fox or two. The woods were alive, but still I saw no one. Sometimes, I heard the distant sound of a truck on a road far away, but it was so faint it could have been my imagination. At first, the isolation was comforting. I could wake and sleep on my schedule. I could eat when I wanted. I could move without any interruption. But as the days passed, the quiet became heavier, denser. The shadows inside the cabin seemed to linger longer, and I started noticing small things that unsettled me. A window I thought I had closed was slightly ajar. A stick from the firewood pile had shifted overnight. A small smear of mud on the floor that hadn't been there before. I told myself it was the wind, the animals, or my own memory playing tricks on me. Still, my unease grew. I started checking the locks on the doors more than necessary, moving quietly around the cabin so I wouldn't startle anything outside, and keeping the flashlight within arm's reach at all times. Even when I was outside, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. One afternoon, around the third day, I decided to take a longer walk into the deeper part of the woods. I left the cabin with my pack, filled with water and some food, and I followed a narrow path that twisted deeper between the trees. The further I went, the denser the forest became. Branches scratched my arms despite my long sleeves, and roots threatened to trip me with every step. I felt exhilarated at first, the isolation, the silence, the sheer remoteness, but after a while, a tight knot formed in my stomach. The path I had taken didn't match the map I had downloaded, and I realized I hadn't marked any way back. I stopped, looked around, and tried to orient myself. The sunlight was filtering unevenly through the canopy, making it difficult to judge direction. The following days were a constant battle of vigilance. I ventured outside only during daylight, taking sticks or my knife for defense. I moved quietly, watching for movement, checking the surroundings constantly. Every rustle, every branch snapping triggered my nerves. I tried to rationalize. Maybe it was a hiker, maybe a bear, maybe someone curious or malicious. Every option was frightening. I started to notice small signs. A cut branch here, a small pile of rocks there. Things moved or missing when I returned inside. The forest felt like it was watching, alive in a way I hadn't understood before. On the sixth day, the tension reached a peak. I had gone to the river to collect water when I noticed something unusual. The footprints weren't alone anymore. They were paired with smaller ones, inconsistent in size, sometimes overlaying each other. Someone had been following, or worse, was using the terrain to observe and test me. Panic surged. I ran back to the cabin, adrenaline pumping, and double-checked the locks, barricades, and emergency supplies. My mind replayed every noise, every shadow. I was trapped in a cage of my own making, the forest no longer peaceful but a labyrinth of threat. Then came the night that forced me to act. Late, around 2 a.m, the scraping returned, louder and more purposeful. I could hear someone walking deliberately, circling the cabin, testing doors. I waited, knife in hand, breathing shallow, and then a loud crash. The back window shattered, splinters flying. Instinct took over. I grabbed my flashlight, aiming it toward the noise, and ran toward the front door, realizing escape was the only option. I ran through the forest, dark and disorienting, branches tearing at my clothes, my legs slipping in mud, but adrenaline and fear fueled every step. I didn't know if anyone followed. I kept running for what felt like miles, until the river appeared in front of me. I plunged in, swimming across the cold water, each stroke burning, hoping the current would hide my path. On the other side, I didn't stop. I ran until the first signs of a road appeared. Exhausted, soaked, bleeding from scrapes, I finally reached a highway where a passing car stopped. I didn't wait. I ran into the light and flagged them down. The police came and I led them back to the cabin. It was empty, no signs of who had been there besides the footprints and minor disturbances. They scoured the surrounding area but found nothing. I never discovered the identity of whoever had been testing me. The cabin was abandoned after that. I went home, traumatized, hyper-aware, forever changed by those days alone in the forest. Over time, I tried to rationalize what had happened. Perhaps it was a hunter, perhaps someone scouting the area for their own purposes, or even a trespasser who had abandoned their attempt. I never saw anyone. The forest kept its secrets, and I left mine behind, carrying only the knowledge that isolation can be deceptive and dangerous, that even a place meant for peace can hold the threat of real human malice. I never returned to the cabin, but the memory remained vivid. The quiet forest, the strange tracks, the scraping, the fear, and the cold river that became my salvation. Even now, years later, when I walk in parks or forests, I notice the subtle signs of movement. A displaced leaf, a snapped twig, a shadow just out of place. My mind always checks, always wonders. I learned that true isolation can be terrifying, and survival isn't about courage. It's about awareness, timing, and the raw instinct to move when danger comes. The cabin was a lesson in fear, real and human, and I carry it still. I kept moving, telling myself I would eventually reach the cabin. I tried to mark trees with scratches on the bark or dropped pieces of cloth, but nothing looked familiar. After hours of walking, I found myself at a small clearing I didn't recognize. The silence was complete, heavier than before. No birds, no insects, not even the rustle of a distant animal. My chest tightened. I realized I had gone far enough to be genuinely lost. I tried to retrace my steps, but the forest all looked the same. Every tree seemed identical, every patch of dirt indistinguishable from another. Panic began to set in. I quickened my pace, trying to keep calm, but the fear made my thoughts scatter. Hours passed. My water supply ran low. My stomach twisted from hunger and the stress. The shadows grew longer as the sun began to sink behind the trees. I realized I had no idea which way the cabin lay, and the reality of the situation hit me. I was genuinely alone. No one would come looking for me until I was overdue, and even then, they wouldn't know where to start. I felt small and powerless, surrounded by trees that seemed endless, a forest that had swallowed me whole. Night came while I was still in the clearing. I had no choice but to find some shelter, so I built a small lean-to from fallen branches and leaves, hoping it would protect me from the cold. I shivered under it, the darkness pressing close. Every sound in the forest felt magnified. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling, distant groans I couldn't identify. I tried to sleep, but every nerve in my body was alert, waiting for danger that might never come. Hunger and thirst gnawed at me. The reality of my situation, the isolation, the exposure, the lack of knowledge about where I was, hit me fully. When morning came, I was exhausted but determined not to panic. I tried a systematic approach. I walked in a single direction for hours, looking for signs of my path, tracks I might have left, anything familiar. I remembered the lake near the cabin and decided that if I could find water, it might help me orient myself. I followed a faint sound of running water and eventually reached a narrow stream. It wasn't the lake, but it gave me hope. I drank carefully, conserving energy and moving slowly to avoid getting hurt. I followed the stream downstream, thinking it would eventually lead me somewhere recognizable. By late afternoon, I saw a glimmer through the trees, sunlight reflecting off water. I ran toward it, relief flooding me, and realized it was the lake by the cabin. I could see the outline of the cabin in the distance. Exhaustion and relief collided, and I ran the final stretch, nearly falling over roots and rocks, until I was at the edge of the lake. The cabin stood as it had the first day, silent, waiting. I was shaking, covered in dirt, scratches, and sweat, but I was home. Once inside, I locked the doors and collapsed onto the bed. I boiled water, ate a small portion of food, and drank deeply, feeling the tension leave my body slowly. I spent the rest of the evening carefully inspecting the cabin, ensuring everything was secure. Nothing had changed. Nothing had moved. My imagination had been working against me more than anything else. The forest was indifferent to my presence. There was no malice, no danger beyond my own mistakes and lack of preparation. Over the next few days, I recovered. I organized my supplies more carefully, created marked paths around the cabin, and planned all walks with clear return points. The fear that had gripped me dissipated, replaced by cautious respect for the isolation I had sought. The woods were beautiful, but they were also unforgiving if one was careless. I learned to observe, to prepare, to respect the limits of solitude. By the end of the week, I packed my things and left, careful to leave the cabin as I had found it. The drive back was quiet, but I felt a strange gratitude for the experience. I had faced fear and panic alone, navigated through real danger, and returned safely. The forest had not been hostile, but it had been a mirror, reflecting my own vulnerabilities. I never returned to that cabin. I didn't need to. The memory of being completely alone, of getting lost and finding my way back, stayed with me. It taught me the value of preparation, the weight of silence, and the reality of fear when stripped of distractions. And while the cabin was just a building, and the forest just a collection of trees and animals, the experience had left me changed, aware, cautious, and respectful of the isolation I had once sought so eagerly. I had been looking forward to this trip for months, counting the days until I could leave the city behind and disappear into the woods for a week. I had rented a small cabin tucked deep in a national forest, far from any roads that saw more than the occasional hiker or ranger. It wasn't fancy, just a single room with a wood stove, a small kitchen area, a lofted bed, and windows that overlooked the dense trees around the clearing. But that was exactly what I wanted: isolation. The thought of spending days surrounded by nothing but the smell of pine and the sound of the wind through the trees was exhilarating. I arrived in the late afternoon. The road leading to the cabin was more of a narrow dirt track than an actual road, and my car bounced and rattled over the uneven surface. The last mile was barely wide enough for a single vehicle, and the ruts were deep enough to make me fear for the undercarriage. But the moment I turned the final bend and saw the cabin sitting quietly among the trees, the stress of the drive melted away. The sun was already dipping toward the horizon, and its low light painted the forest in deep, long shadows. The cabin itself was small and weathered. The wood was gray and rough. The roof had patches that looked like they had been repaired over the years, and the windows were clouded, making it impossible to see inside until I opened the door. There was a small porch with a creaking railing and a stack of firewood neatly piled against the wall. I left my bag in the car and walked up, feeling the crunch of pine needles under my boots. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood and a faint hint of mildew. Dust floated in the thin shafts of light that came through the windows. Everything was sparse. A small table and 2 chairs, a basic kitchen counter with a tiny sink, and the loft above for the bed. The wood stove was cold, but there was a stack of kindling beside it. I dropped my bag near the bed, set my phone on the table, and went straight to the porch to take in the forest. The silence was immediate. Even though I had spent my life in cities, I was used to some level of background noise, traffic, distant voices, the hum of electricity. Here, there was nothing but the occasional bird and the rustle of leaves in the wind. It was peaceful, but the stillness also made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I reminded myself that I wanted this: the quiet, the emptiness, the complete absence of other people. I spent the next hour unpacking and organizing my things. I set up my small camping stove on the counter and prepared a simple meal. The sun dipped fully below the trees, and the forest was swallowed by darkness. I lit the wood stove and watched the flames spread through the logs, feeling the warmth creep into the cabin. Outside, shadows danced as the firelight flickered through the windows. It was beautiful in a way that made me feel both calm and slightly exposed, like the forest was watching me without really being there. I went to bed early, exhausted from the drive and the unpacking. I had brought a small lantern, which I set on the floor beside the bed. The loft creaked beneath me as I climbed up, the wood groaning under my weight. The wind blew more strongly now, and I could hear it whistling through gaps in the cabin's exterior. Somewhere in the distance, an animal howled. I tried to settle myself, to let the peace of the forest lull me to sleep. Then I heard it. It was faint at first, a soft, dragging noise outside, like something heavy moving across the forest floor. My stomach tightened. I froze, straining to listen. The sound was deliberate, slow, methodical. Something was moving just beyond the clearing, close enough that I could hear the rustle of leaves and the snap of small branches underfoot. I tried to convince myself it was a deer or some other animal, but the sound wasn't right. It wasn't light or hurried. It was slow, almost careful, like whoever or whatever was out there didn't want to be noticed but was taking their time anyway. I stayed in the loft, gripping the edge of the bed. The wind seemed to die down, and then I heard a different sound. A low, deliberate tap against the cabin's wooden siding.
Top, top, top.
I held my breath, heart hammering. Another tap, then another. It was coming from the far side of the cabin, the side where the shadows were deepest. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I considered grabbing the small hatchet I had brought for firewood, but I didn't want to make my presence known. I told myself it was probably a branch falling in the wind, that I was just imagining things. But the taps continued, one after the other, slow, precise, deliberate. Hours passed like that. Every time I thought I heard nothing, a tap or a rustle reminded me that something, or someone, was out there. My mind raced through possibilities. A lost hiker, someone looking to steal from an empty cabin, a poacher. Each possibility was worse than the last. Couldn't sleep. I didn't even dare light my lantern again, afraid it would give away my presence. The first light, I dared to peer out the window. The forest was calm, peaceful even, bathed in the soft glow of early morning. Nothing moved. No footprints, no broken branches, no sign of intrusion. I forced myself to eat a small breakfast and brew coffee, though my hands trembled. I considered leaving immediately, but the road was long, and I had driven far the previous day. The day passed slowly. I kept busy, trying to convince myself I had imagined everything. I chopped firewood, swept the cabin floor, and took short walks along the edge of the clearing. Everything was normal. Nothing was out of place, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of knowing that the woods were hiding something just beyond the trees. Night came again. This time I was determined to be ready. I set up the hatchet beside the bed and kept my phone charged, although I had no signal. I moved the lantern closer so I could see the loft stairs. The wind picked up again, and the forest became alive with sound. Branches snapping, leaves rustling, the faint scuttle of small animals. And then the tapping began once more on the same side of the cabin. It was different this time, faster, louder, almost impatient. My heart raced as I tried to figure out what to do. I couldn't see through the dark windows, and I wasn't sure if the person outside could see me either. Then I noticed something through the faint light of the moon. A shadow, moving along the edge of the clearing. Not like a deer, not like a bear, but upright, human. Panic surged through me. I grabbed the hatchet and held it like a weapon, every muscle in my body tense. The shadow paused, then disappeared behind the trees. I considered running, but I had no shoes on and the cabin door creaked loudly. If whoever was out there was waiting, any sudden movement might draw them closer. I stayed in the loft all night, listening to every sound. By morning, the forest was quiet again. I forced myself to eat and gather my things. I packed everything quickly, trying to leave no trace that I had been there for more than a day. As I stepped outside, the early sunlight made the forest seem calm and almost beautiful, but I saw something that made my stomach drop. Footprints, human, circling the cabin and disappearing into the trees. I ran. I didn't walk. I didn't stop to look back. The drive out of the forest was tense. every bump in the dirt road making me jump. I didn't see anyone else, but I didn't need to. I knew I had been watched. I knew that whoever had been out there could still be there, hiding, waiting for someone else to stumble into the cabin. I made it back to the main road as quickly as I could. The city felt like a wall of safety after the isolation, the fear, the knowing. I never went back to the cabin, and I never will. Even months later, I could still hear the slow, deliberate taps echoing in my mind. I still see the shadow moving just beyond the trees, waiting. It was supposed to be a peaceful escape. Instead, it became the most real and terrifying experience of my life. I never doubted the stories of remote cabin break-ins after that. Sometimes the most isolated places aren't safe at all. They just hide danger until it's ready to strike. I had been planning the cabin trip for months. The idea was simple. Escape the city, disconnect, spend a week alone in the woods, and recharge. I found the cabin online through a small rental site. It was remote, surrounded by dense forest, with a narrow dirt road leading to it. The pictures showed a simple log cabin, 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, a wood-burning stove, and a porch that overlooked a clearing. It seemed perfect. I packed my car with supplies, thinking I had everything I could need. Canned food, a small water filter, matches, a first aid kit, a few extra blankets, and plenty of clothes. I also brought my camera, notebooks, and some books, thinking I could spend my evenings writing or reading. The drive to the cabin was long. The city fell behind me, replaced by stretches of highway lined with trees, then smaller, winding roads, and finally a narrow dirt path that seemed to vanish into the forest. First, I enjoyed the quiet. There was no traffic, no bright lights, no sounds except for the occasional bird or rustle of leaves in the wind. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was low, casting a golden glow across the treetops. The cabin was even more isolated than I imagined. It sat in a small clearing with the forest pressing in on all sides. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. It was the kind of place that felt peaceful and lonely at the same time. I unloaded my car, carrying the bags into the cabin. Inside, it was cozy. The wooden floors were cold under my feet, and the air smelled faintly of old wood and dust. The main room had a small kitchen, a wood-burning stove, and a table. Off to the side were 2 bedrooms and a small bathroom. There were shelves with old, worn books and a few board games. The windows looked out over the clearing and the forest beyond. I unpacked, set up my sleeping area, and started a small fire in the stove to take the chill out of the room. I felt satisfied, alone in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. The first night passed uneventfully. I cooked a simple meal over the stove, then sat on the porch as the sun set. The forest grew dark, the sounds of crickets and frogs filling the air. I felt calm, but as the night went on, I began to notice small things. A snapping branch in the distance, the sound of leaves rustling when there was no wind. At first, I told myself it was just animals, deer or raccoons, moving through the undergrowth. But the sounds were different than anything I had heard before. There was a method to them, a pattern. I couldn't see anything from the porch in the darkness, but the feeling of being watched settled over me. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself I was just tired and my imagination was playing tricks. I went to bed, leaving the stove to burn low and the cabin door locked. Sleep came slowly. I woke several times in the night to the feeling of being observed. There was no one there, nothing I could see. But every time I opened my eyes, I felt that invisible weight pressing on me. By morning, I felt exhausted, unsettled, but the daylight made everything seem normal again. The next day, I explored the surroundings. The forest was dense, full of thick undergrowth and tall trees. I found a small stream running through the trees behind the cabin and followed it for a while. I marked the path so I could return safely. The cabin felt safe in the daylight, but I couldn't shake the feeling from the night before. I kept thinking I saw glimpses of something moving between the trees, just at the edge of my vision. A shape, a shadow, always gone when I turned to look directly. That night, the feeling worsened. The sounds outside seemed closer. Twigs snapped under heavy steps, not the light tapping of a small animal. Something was moving around the cabin, pacing in the darkness. I sat by the stove, listening, waiting for it to stop. Hours passed. My mind raced. I checked the locks on every door and window, made sure my phone was charged, but the remote location meant no signal. If something happened, I was alone. The snapping and rustling continued intermittently, always outside. Occasionally, I thought I heard a low growl like a large dog or wild animal, but it was muffled, distant, and impossible to pinpoint. The third day, I ventured farther, trying to calm my nerves with movement and purpose. I walked along the stream and found a faint trail leading deeper into the forest. It looked old, rarely used, but it had tracks, human footprints. That discovery made my stomach twist. Someone had been here recently, close to the cabin, maybe watching it. My first instinct was to turn back, but curiosity drove me to follow it a little farther. The footprints were fresh, too fresh to be more than a day old. I retraced my steps carefully, making mental notes of landmarks to avoid getting lost. My anxiety built with every step back toward the cabin. That night, I barricaded the doors with whatever I could find. Chairs, a small table, and anything heavy. I stayed in the main room, near the stove, and kept a kitchen knife beside me. The sounds returned shortly after sunset. Heavy steps, deliberate, moving slowly around the cabin. I didn't see them, but I could feel them, hear them, imagine them. I stayed quiet, barely breathing, trying to make myself invisible. Hours passed. The sounds finally faded, leaving only the usual rustling of animals. My body was tense, every muscle tight. I didn't sleep well. The following morning, I decided I could not stay another night without investigating. I needed to know what I was dealing with. I left early, taking a cautious approach, staying low, keeping behind trees. About 200 meters from the cabin, I found clear evidence of someone having been there recently. Footprints leading from the cabin to a small clearing in the woods, and what looked like a makeshift campfire site. The ground was disturbed, bits of burnt wood scattered around. It was clear someone had been living or hiding there, possibly watching the cabin for days. Fear and anger mixed in me. I took photos with my camera, documenting everything, thinking I might need them later. I returned to the cabin and decided to spend the day packing up. I would leave at nightfall. As I gathered my belongings, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Fresh footprints in the mud right up to the cabin door, not my own. Someone had been here while I was out. The barricade I thought would be protective would have done nothing. My heart raced. I grabbed my phone and tried to get a signal. Still nothing. I realized the only option was to leave immediately, not waiting for the sun to set. I stuffed everything into my backpack and double-checked my locks, then stepped outside. The forest was quiet, too quiet. I walked quickly along the dirt path, glancing back constantly. I saw movement between the trees, a figure moving slowly, keeping distance, watching. Panic surged, but I forced myself to keep moving. I remembered the road leading back to the highway and focused on that. After what felt like hours, I emerged onto the paved road, lights from passing cars shining. Relief washed over me. I flagged down a car and explained in rapid bursts that I had been followed, watched, alone in the woods. They didn't fully understand, but they drove me back toward town. The police were called the next day. They searched the area around the cabin. Evidence of recent human activity was found. A small hidden campsite, footprints, and some stolen supplies from previous visitors. They couldn't find anyone in the woods at that moment, but the trail suggested the person had left during the night, keeping hidden until they could move freely. The cabin was cleared and deemed safe, but I never returned. The experience stayed with me, vivid and raw, the sense of being alone and hunted in a place that was supposed to be peaceful. After weeks of processing, I realized that the fear I had felt was real, tangible, and human, not a product of imagination or folklore. It was a lesson in isolation, in vigilance, and in understanding that even places that seem remote and safe can hide dangers of a very real kind. I eventually wrote a detailed account of the experience, hoping others would take caution if they ever sought solitude in the wilderness. The cabin itself was sold soon after, the new owners unaware of the events, but I never wanted to go back. I had learned the hard way that the wilderness is not always empty, and that sometimes the most terrifying presence is another person, invisible, patient, and watching. I had been planning the trip for months, but nothing in my planning prepared me for the reality of being alone in that cabin. It was tucked deep in the forest, a good 5 miles from the nearest road, and reachable only by a narrow, dirt path that twisted through dense trees. The map I had found online made it look simple, almost welcoming, but standing at the edge of the woods, I realized how isolated it really was. The air smelled of damp earth and pine needles, and the wind moved through the trees with a sound that made my skin prickle. I carried my backpack, heavy with supplies. A week's worth of food, water, blankets, a small first aid kit, some basic tools, a lantern, batteries, a fire starter, and my small camping stove. I had double-checked everything twice, but now, as I took the first few steps on the uneven path, I felt a knot of unease in my stomach. The walk took longer than I expected. Branches scraped at my jacket. Roots threatened to trip me with every step, and the ground grew increasingly uneven. The sun had begun to sink behind the trees when I first saw the cabin. At a distance, it looked small and harmless, the kind of place you might imagine for a quiet weekend getaway. But as I approached, I could see the peeling paint, the sagging roof, and the windows that reflected the last streaks of light in an almost ominous way. The porch creaked under my weight as I stepped up, and the door didn't resist when I pushed it open. Inside, it smelled of old wood and dust, mixed with the faint, sour scent of mold. The interior was simple: a main room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen area with a cracked sink, and a couple of rooms off to the sides. Everything was coated in a thin layer of grime, like it had been waiting, forgotten, for years. I flicked the light switch, but nothing happened. I sighed and decided to rely on the lantern for now, placing it on the counter so I could unpack. The first night was hard. The cabin made every sound seem exaggerated. The wind rattled the windows, and the old wood of the floor groaned with every movement. I was certain I could hear footsteps outside, or maybe it was just the wind moving the branches so they scratched against the walls. My mind wanted to imagine someone watching, but I kept telling myself it was impossible. I had parked my car several miles away, and the nearest person was too far for anyone to just wander here without notice. Still, the darkness in the cabin felt heavier than it should, like it pressed down on my shoulders, and sleep came in fits and starts. I woke early the next morning. Sunlight slanted through the trees and illuminated dust particles in the air, turning them into tiny specks of gold. I made a small breakfast of oatmeal and coffee, then set out to explore the area around the cabin. The forest was thick, alive with birds and small animals. I could see deer tracks in the mud near the stream that ran behind the cabin. The trail I had followed to reach the cabin was overgrown, and I realized that it wouldn't be easy to find again without careful attention. It made me uneasy. If something happened, I wasn't sure I could leave quickly. But I tried to push the thought away and spent the day gathering firewood, checking the nearby stream for fresh water, and trying to organize the cabin to feel less like a neglected space. The physical work tired me out, and I hoped I would sleep better that night. Night fell faster than I expected. By the time darkness fully descended, I was already sitting by the fireplace, trying to get it started. It took longer than it should have. The wood was damp and the kindling barely caught. By the time the fire was stable, the night was completely around me. I heard sounds again, shifts in the trees, the snap of twigs. It wasn't unusual in the forest, but being alone amplified every noise. I reminded myself of this repeatedly, sitting close to the warmth, my senses hyper-focused. Around midnight, I was certain I heard a voice, or at least a sound resembling a human voice, coming from the woods behind the cabin. It was faint, just a murmur carried on the wind, but it made my heart leap. I sat frozen, straining to hear more. Silence returned. I convinced myself it was an animal, maybe a fox or a small deer moving through the underbrush, and finally managed to calm down enough to sleep, though I kept the axe I had leaned against the wall close to me. The following morning, I realized something unsettling. My firewood pile, which I had meticulously stacked near the side of the cabin, had been disturbed. A few pieces were shifted, and some were partially moved toward the edge of the forest. At first, I thought the wind or an animal might have done it. But when I checked the surrounding area, I noticed footprints in the mud. Human footprints. They were faint but distinct, leading from the woods to the cabin and back into the trees. I froze, staring at them, trying to convince myself that it must have been some hiker or someone passing by. But the deeper part of me knew it wasn't likely. No trail, no signs of human presence anywhere nearby. The nearest road was miles away, and no one had told me anyone else would be here. I spent hours examining the prints, the weight of realization settling on me. Someone had been around the cabin, close enough to touch it, and they had done so without leaving a trace beyond these prints. For the next couple of days, I stayed on high alert. I didn't leave the cabin except to gather water from the stream, and even then I carried the axe with me. Each time I looked out the windows, I felt like I was being watched. At one point, I saw a shadow dart between the trees, just far enough away to avoid detail, but close enough to make me tense up. I checked the locks, reinforced the windows with boards I found in the shed, and made a plan in case someone tried to enter while I slept. My food and water supplies were limited, but more concerning was the idea of someone lingering in the woods, observing, waiting for a moment when I would be vulnerable. I began sleeping in short bursts, waking every few hours to check the doors and windows. The cabin, once a place I thought I could relax, became a prison of constant vigilance. Then, on the fourth night, I heard the scraping. It was slow, deliberate, coming from the porch. I didn't move at first, listening. Then it became louder, a heavy, rhythmic noise, like someone testing the strength of the door or the boards on the windows. I gripped the axe tightly, crouching near the fireplace, and waited. The sound stopped as suddenly as it had started. I held my breath, convinced it would return at any moment. I realized then that I couldn't stay in the cabin forever, but leaving meant walking through the forest with someone potentially following me. My mind raced through options. I considered signaling for help, but my phone had no signal. I had to make a decision. Wait and risk a confrontation here or try to escape through the woods. By dawn, I had decided to leave. I packed essential supplies quickly: food, water, clothes, the first aid kit, and the axe. I left a note in case someone found it, explaining that I was leaving due to unexpected danger. I waited until the sky brightened enough to navigate easily. The forest seemed quieter than before, almost still, but I kept my senses sharp. Each snap of a twig made me flinch. Each movement of the branches made my heart jump. I followed the path I had arrived on, making sure to mark my route mentally so I wouldn't get lost. The sun was fully up when I finally reached the clearing where I had parked my car. Relief washed over me as I climbed inside, locking the doors immediately. I stayed there for a few minutes, trying to calm my shaking hands. Driving away from the cabin, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see someone following. There was nothing, only trees passing by. I kept driving until the forest opened into the highway. Only then did I allow myself to breathe fully. I reported the disturbance to the local authorities, describing the footprints and sounds I had experienced. They told me no one had been reported in the area, and they planned to investigate the cabin. It was a small comfort, but the experience left me changed. The memory of the isolation, the sense of being watched, the unnerving realization of human presence in a place I had thought abandoned, stayed with me for months. I never returned to that part of the forest, and I still cannot explain who or what had been so close to me in that cabin, testing, observing, waiting. The relief of leaving and knowing I was safe became something I clung to, a reminder that even in the quietest, most forgotten places, there are risks we cannot always anticipate. The cabin remains abandoned, as far as I know. I sometimes think about it, imagining the footprints still pressed into the mud, the boards on the windows waiting to be disturbed again. I know now that isolation is not always peaceful, and the forest does not forgive careless assumptions. But I survived, and in that survival, I found a clarity I did not expect. Awareness, caution, and the understanding that even a simple cabin can hold unimaginable tension when solitude turns into danger. I had been planning the trip for months, though at the time it felt like just a normal getaway. I wanted to get away from the constant noise of the city, the work calls, the endless screen time, and the obligations that never seemed to end. I found a small cabin tucked deep in the forest, far from roads and power lines, something I thought would be perfect for being alone and completely disconnected. It was advertised as rustic, with minimal amenities, a fireplace, and a nearby river. When I drove up the narrow, winding dirt road, the isolation hit me immediately. The trees were dense, older than anything I had ever seen in the city parks or suburban forests. Their trunks were thick, the underbrush almost impenetrable, and the air smelled of wet pine and damp soil. The sun was low, almost amber, and it was the kind of light that makes shadows feel darker, more solid than usual. The cabin itself was small but sturdy. The wood smelled faintly of smoke and old pine. The door creaked when I opened it, revealing a single room with a fireplace, a small kitchen area, and a loft where a bed was tucked under the eaves. There was a stack of firewood by the side, a bucket of water for emergencies, and a small supply of canned food. The walls were bare, save for a few hooks for coats and hats. Everything felt untouched, as if the place had not seen anyone for months. I unpacked slowly, placing my backpack on the floor, my phone on the counter just to check the weak signal one last time. Of course, it was gone almost instantly, as the cabin sat at the edge of cell service. I knew that, but I had still hoped for a miracle. I decided to go for a walk before night fell completely. The forest around the cabin was dense, and the path down to the river was overgrown. I pushed through branches, trying not to trip over roots hidden beneath the thick layer of dead leaves. The air was heavier than usual, moist and cold, and the smell of wet earth clung to my clothes. Birds chirped, though there were fewer than I expected. Occasionally, I would hear a rustle in the underbrush, but it was never clear what had caused it. I kept telling myself it was just deer or small animals, foxes or raccoons, but still, the sounds made my stomach tighten. I found the river after about 30 minutes. It was narrow but deep, the water moving fast over rocks and fallen branches. The noise of the current was loud, almost drowning out every other sound. I watched for a while, listening to the water, hoping to calm the tension I didn't realize had been building inside me. On the way back, I noticed something that made my stomach flip. Footprints in the mud. They were human and they were recent. Deep impressions, as if someone heavy had walked through. I froze, trying to listen for anything, but there was nothing. My heartbeat sped up. The footprints led toward the cabin. I shook my head, trying to convince myself it was impossible, that it could have been animals or a trick of the mud. But the prints were unmistakably human, right down to the shape of the shoes. Back at the cabin, I checked all the doors and windows, making sure everything was locked. I noticed then that the side door, the one I had come in through, had scuff marks in the mud outside. They weren't there before I was sure of it. My mind raced, imagining someone watching me from the woods, someone waiting for night to fall. I tried to calm myself. Maybe it was someone else renting the cabin at a different time. Maybe it was hunters from earlier in the day. Maybe it was nothing at all. I started a fire in the fireplace, the crackle of burning would giving me a small sense of comfort. I cooked a can of beans on the small stove, eating slowly, keeping my ears open for any sound outside. Night came fast. The forest around me went completely dark, the trees turning into black shadows. The only light came from the fire and a small oil lamp I had brought. Every sound seemed magnified, the wind pushing through the branches, the creak of the cabin settling, the distant snap of a branch. I tried to focus on a book, but every sentence blurred as my mind kept wandering back to the footprints, the scuff marks, the possibility of someone out there. I thought about calling the owner, but there was no signal, no way to reach anyone. I was alone, truly alone, and it was a feeling I had never experienced so completely before. Around midnight, I was woken by a noise outside. It was soft at first, almost like a whisper, but then it grew into a rustling, like someone walking through dry leaves. I froze, listening. It stopped suddenly, and I could swear I heard the soft crunch of shoes in the mud. I stayed very still, my back pressed against the wall, my eyes on the small window. The fire had died down a bit, the room bathed in a dim orange glow. Minutes passed, but the sound returned, closer this time, circling the cabin, moving from one side to the other. My hands shook as I grabbed the fireplace poker, holding it like a weapon. I tried to remind myself that it could be an animal, a deer, something big enough to make noise but not human. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time seemed distorted in the dark cabin. I stayed awake, clutching the poker, listening to every sound. Occasionally, there was the faintest scraping against the walls, like someone testing the door handles. My mind raced with worst-case scenarios. Someone trying to break in, someone hiding outside, waiting for me to sleep. I tried to remember everything I had read about surviving dangerous encounters in the wilderness, but fear clouded every thought. By morning, I hadn't slept. The sun was rising, and the light made the forest seem less threatening, though the fear hadn't completely gone. I looked outside. There were more footprints. They weren't heading toward the cabin this time. They were circling it, forming an irregular ring around the small clearing. Whoever had been there last night had moved around, almost stalking, almost measuring. I packed some food and water into my backpack. I decided that leaving was the only option. I would hike down the road and find the nearest gas station, nearest town, anywhere with people. I left the cabin cautiously, sticking close to the underbrush. The forest seemed quieter in the daylight, but every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, made me jump. The footprints continued, but they stopped at the tree line closest to the road. I felt a small measure of relief, thinking maybe whoever had been there had left. I walked fast, keeping my head down, my ears open. When I finally reached the dirt road, I saw tire tracks in the mud. Recent. My stomach sank. Someone had been driving nearby. I kept walking, eventually reaching a paved road and then a small gas station. The employees looked at me with mild concern. I was covered in mud, my clothes torn from the forest, my hair disheveled. I asked for directions to the nearest police station, and they gave them to me without hesitation. I walked there, keeping my pace brisk, and when I arrived, I explained everything. The officers were kind, taking notes and asking questions. They said they would check the area, patrol the road, and make sure no one had been using the cabin illegally. They asked if I wanted to return there with them, but I refused. I couldn't go back to that place where I had felt so vulnerable. In the weeks after, I couldn't shake the memory of that night. The way the footprints circled the cabin, the way the sounds moved through the darkness, the certainty that someone had been there watching. I eventually went back to that area during the day cautiously with friends and police officers. They found nothing unusual, no signs of a permanent encampment or evidence of other people. It seemed as if whoever had been there had left quickly, leaving only their prints and my fear behind. I sold the cabin rental listing from my memory. I never wanted to go back, and I warned others about that road, that part of the forest that felt more dangerous than it had any right to. I learned from that experience that nature can be beautiful but also unpredictable, that isolation is not always peaceful, and that fear is a very real thing, not something conjured up by the imagination, but something that can exist without cause, or with causes so small they become terrifying in the dark. I never forgot the feeling of walking past those footprints, of seeing the scuff marks in the mud, of being watched without knowing it. I carry that memory like a scar, not because of what happened, but because of what could have happened. That cabin was real, the forest was real, the fear was real, and I survived it. I returned to the city, to noise, to work, to people, and to safety. I never went back to that forest, but I never forgot it either. Months later, when I looked at maps of the area, I noticed a series of abandoned roads, small clearings that weren't marked, and I realized that the forest had been full of these little hidden spaces. People could live there, move quietly, hide from the world, and never be found. I shivered, understanding that the night I had spent in that cabin could have been much worse if whoever had been following me had decided to stay longer, to wait, to strike. I am careful now when I venture into the wilderness, even in daylight. I carry a small flashlight, a knife, extra water, and a satellite phone. I learned to respect the forest and the isolation. That cabin, that trip, was a lesson. Real fear is not about ghosts or shadows, but about knowing that there are others out there, watching, waiting, moving silently where you cannot see them. And surviving that knowledge is something that stays with you forever. I survived because I stayed aware, because I didn't assume safety, because I listened and observed. And that night, as terrifying as it was, became a benchmark for caution, for preparedness, and for respect for the wilderness. It is a story I carry with me, not as a ghost story, but as a reality check, a reminder that the world is not always safe, and that vigilance can save you when danger is silent, patient, and unseen. I had always liked the idea of being completely alone in the woods, surrounded by nothing but trees, the quiet hum of nature, and the occasional rustle of animals. For months, I had planned a solo trip to a small cabin tucked away in a remote section of the mountains. The cabin was old but sturdy, with thick wooden walls and a roof that had weathered decades of snow and rain. It was miles away from the nearest town, and the road leading up to it was little more than a narrow dirt path that wound through dense forest. I had driven for hours, my truck bumping over potholes and rocks, until the last few miles when I parked at the edge of the trailhead. From there, it was a steep, grueling hike with all my gear on my back. The air was thick with the scent of pine and wet earth as I navigated the narrow trail. Every few steps, I could hear the soft crack of twigs underfoot, and the occasional distant call of a bird or rustling of some animal in the underbrush. The cabin came into view as I rounded the last bend of the trail, its wooden structure blending into the shadowed edge of the trees. It looked smaller than I had imagined, but it had a kind of quiet, stubborn charm, as if it had been waiting patiently for someone to occupy it again. The windows were grimy, covered with a film of dust and rain residue, and the porch boards creaked under my weight as I approached. Inside, the cabin smelled of damp wood and old smoke. It had a single room with a fireplace, a small kitchen corner, a narrow staircase leading to a loft above, and a few dusty shelves. I dropped my pack near the door and began unpacking, placing supplies neatly on the counter and setting up my small camping stove. I had brought plenty of food, water, a first aid kit, and a reliable flashlight. I also had a hand axe and a small, sturdy folding shovel just in case. I wanted to make sure I was fully prepared. As the day faded, I gathered firewood from the surrounding area. The air had turned colder, sharper, carrying a subtle hint of winter even though it was still late autumn. I stacked the wood in a small pile near the fireplace, admiring the way the low sunlight filtered through the gaps in the cabin walls, making long, thin shadows across the floor. It felt quiet and peaceful, the kind of peace that settles over you when there is no one around. No noise, nothing to disturb the rhythm of the world except your own breath and heartbeat. That night, I lit a fire and sat on the rough wooden floor, warming my hands and watching the flames dance. The isolation felt good at first, calming in a strange way. I kept a small battery-powered lantern nearby in case the fire went out and made sure my knife was within reach. Outside, the wind rattled the trees, and the occasional animal call reminded me I was alone in a wilderness where no one else would be coming. I went to bed early, knowing I had a long day ahead of hiking and exploring, and the bed in the loft was a simple mattress with a wool blanket. It wasn't comfortable in a luxurious sense, but it was sufficient for rest. The next morning, I woke to a faint dripping sound. At first, I thought it was rain, but the sky was clear when I looked out the window. Then I realized it was the slow, deliberate sound of water coming from somewhere inside the cabin. I traced it to the corner near the back wall, where a small leak had started near the ceiling. Water was seeping down, dripping onto the floor. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make me uneasy. I tried to plug it temporarily with some cloths I had brought, but I knew I would have to inspect the roof later. Still, it was a minor setback, nothing I couldn't handle. As the day went on, I decided to explore the surrounding area. I carried my backpack, water, and a small hatchet, and followed a narrow trail that led through dense trees and moss-covered rocks. The forest was thick, and sunlight barely reached the ground in some places. I saw evidence of wildlife, scratches on tree trunks, footprints in the mud, and scat near the path. There was a sense of life moving around me, hidden but present. Despite the beauty, a feeling of tension began to settle in my chest. I was acutely aware of just how isolated I was, how far the cabin was from the nearest road, and how quickly things could go wrong if I got hurt or lost. I returned to the cabin that evening, tired but satisfied with my hike. I had found a small stream a few hundred yards away, which would serve as a reliable water source. I also noticed some areas where firewood was more abundant. While unpacking the extra supplies I had brought, I realized that the leak had worsened slightly. A thin trickle of water was now running along the corner, soaking part of the wooden floor. I could fix it with some tools, but it would take time and attention. Still, it wasn't urgent, and I decided I would address it in the morning. That night, a strong wind picked up. I could hear the trees swaying and the occasional branch snapping under pressure. The cabin groaned and shifted as the wind pressed against it, and the small drip of water from the ceiling seemed louder somehow, echoing in the quiet. Sleep was fitful. Every creak and snap outside made me tense, imagining what could be out there. It was a small, rational fear. There were bears in this region, and the forest was home to wolves and other predators. But the wind, the darkness, and the isolation magnified every sound and movement. By the third day, the weather had changed. Clouds had rolled in, and rain began to fall steadily. The cabin felt colder, damp, and heavier. I spent the day inside, chopping wood, repairing minor leaks, and reinforcing the small door locks with my tools. The fire kept the room warm enough, but the sound of the rain beating against the roof and walls was constant. It made me anxious. I kept checking the small windows, peering into the gray, wet forest. There was no sign of anyone else, no vehicles on the distant dirt road, nothing but the endless rain and the dark green of the trees. Around late afternoon, I noticed something odd. Footprints in the mud outside the cabin, heading toward the woods. They were too large for any animal I had seen and seemed deliberate. At first, I thought it might have been a hunter or someone passing through, but I remembered I hadn't seen anyone else for miles, and the nearest cabin or road was far. The thought made my stomach tighten. Whoever it was had come close enough to leave footprints in the mud, close enough to see the cabin clearly. I checked my small lock on the door and made sure the windows were secure. The forest around me felt suddenly more menacing. The rain continued into the night. I sat by the fire with my flashlight and my knife close. Every sound outside, the wind, the trees, the rain, seemed amplified. I tried to calm myself, telling myself the footprints could have been old or washed by rain, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone might be nearby. Sleep came reluctantly, and I kept the lantern on, knowing I would wake at the slightest noise. The next morning, the rain had stopped, leaving the forest wet and foggy. I went outside to check the perimeter. The footprints were still there, faint but visible in the mud. They seemed to lead deeper into the woods and stopped abruptly near a cluster of large rocks. There was no other sign of a person, no discarded items, no sign of a camp. It was as if someone had walked carefully and intentionally avoided leaving evidence beyond the initial trail. I felt a mix of relief and anxiety. I was alone, yet I wasn't. Over the next few days, I took precautions. I secured all the doors and windows, kept the fire going, and carried my knife whenever I left the cabin. I gathered firewood further from the cabin to avoid being trapped close to it if someone came back. I also found a higher vantage point on a small hill nearby, where I could see the surrounding forest. From there, I felt slightly safer, able to watch for movement or signs of anyone approaching. One evening, as the sun was setting, I noticed something unusual from the hill. A figure moving slowly through the trees, far enough away that I couldn't identify it clearly. My heart raced. It moved with purpose, as if searching. I returned to the cabin quickly, locking every door and window. I stayed inside, sitting by the fire with my knife close, watching the surrounding forest. The figure did not come closer, but it lingered at the edge of my vision, always moving, never stopping. I realized I was dealing with someone who might be watching the cabin, possibly for days. The tension built for hours. I considered leaving, but the forest was dense, and navigating it alone, in the dark with a potential threat, felt dangerous. I stayed put, waiting, listening, staying alert. By morning, the figure was gone. The footprints outside had faded with the rain and mud drying, leaving no trace. I felt a cautious relief, but also a sense of vigilance I had not experienced before. In the following days, I made a careful plan to leave. I packed up all my supplies, taking extra care not to leave anything behind. I moved quietly, avoiding obvious paths, keeping low and alert. I waited for a clear morning when visibility was high and the weather calm. When I finally set off, I kept a close eye on the tree line, alert to any movement. The hike back to my truck was tense, every sound making me jump, every shadow a potential threat. But I kept moving steadily, my preparation and awareness keeping me safe. I reached the truck by late morning, exhausted but unharmed. The forest behind me was quiet, deceptively calm, and I realized how easy it could have been to become trapped, vulnerable, or worse. As I drove away, I reflected on the cabin. The isolation had been beautiful at first, but it had also exposed me to risks I had not anticipated. I had survived, and I had learned the importance of vigilance, preparation, and respecting the wilderness. Not just for its beauty, but for the dangers hidden within it. By the time I reached the nearest town, I was tired, muddy, and worn, but safe. I reported the footprints and possible intruder to the local authorities, who promised to check the area. Though they admitted that remote cabins were often visited by transient people or hunters and that such occurrences were rare, I felt a sense of closure. I had faced a real threat in a real setting, and I had left intact. The experience left me wary but also more attuned to the realities of wilderness survival. I would remember the cabin, the rain, the footprints, and the figure for a long time. Not as a ghost story, not as a fairy tale, but as a very real, frightening encounter that had tested my instincts and my resolve. Even now, months later, I sometimes think back to that cabin. The forest was beautiful, quiet, and serene in a way few people ever experience. But it was also unpredictable, capable of harboring danger, and full of surprises. I learned to respect that, to plan meticulously, and to trust my own judgment above all. The story had a clear ending. I had survived, I had learned, and I had returned home. But it also left a lasting mark, a reminder that isolation carries both beauty and peril, and that careful attention, preparation, and awareness are the difference between safety and disaster. I had been planning this cabin trip for months, and finally, late in the fall, I drove out to the remote mountains where the cabin sat. It wasn't a fancy place, just an old wooden structure tucked into the woods, a place meant for solitude. I had wanted isolation, a week to myself to read, hike, and escape the constant noise of work and city life. The road ended miles before the cabin, turning into a narrow dirt track that twisted through thick pine forests. The further I drove, the narrower the path became, and the forest grew taller, darker, and more oppressive. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was setting, and a thin orange light filtered through the dense trees, casting long shadows that made everything look stranger than it was. The cabin itself was small, maybe 20 feet across in each direction. The wood was weathered and gray, rough to the touch. A stone chimney leaned slightly to one side, and the roof had patches that were clearly old repairs. The windows were grimy, and a thin layer of dust covered everything. Yet there was a comfort in it, a sense that this place had been here for a long time and could withstand the wilderness around it. I parked my car on the uneven ground, grabbed my bags, and stepped inside. The air was cold and smelled of damp wood and pine needles. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and the walls had the faint sound of settling, groaning in a way that seemed alive. Inside, the cabin had a small kitchen area, a living space with an old couch, a table, and a wood stove that had clearly not been used in a while. I set my things down, checked the small supply of firewood stacked in the corner, and began preparing for the night. The first thing I did was light a fire in the stove. The dry wood snapped and hissed, sending up tiny sparks that danced in the dim room. I stacked the logs carefully, listening to the crackle, feeling the room warm slowly around me. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, sending long, slanted shadows across the walls through the grimy windows. I had planned my first hike for the next day, and I went to bed early, waking up to the gray, misty morning that is so common in the mountains. I cooked a simple breakfast on the stove, then laced up my boots and walked into the forest. The trail was faint, overgrown in some parts, and the air smelled of wet earth and decaying leaves. I hiked for hours, the path winding steeper and steeper, until I reached a ridge where I could see the valley below. The view was breathtaking, but there was a tension in the air, a weight that made me keep glancing behind me as if something might follow. I shook the feeling off and continued exploring, taking careful note of landmarks so I could find my way back. By late afternoon, clouds had begun to gather, thick and gray, and a fine rain began to fall. I didn't mind. It made the forest smell sharper, more alive. I made my way back slowly, trying to avoid the mud that turned the trail into slippery sludge. When I reached the cabin, the sky was dark and heavy, and the rain had intensified. I closed the cabin door behind me, shook off my backpack, and tended the fire again. The warmth felt more necessary now, more alive. I cooked a simple dinner, sitting close to the stove, and watched the rain streak down the windows. I noticed that outside, the forest had changed. The wind pushed through the trees differently, making low, whistling sounds. The cabin groaned, the floorboards creaking more than they had the night before. Something about the sounds made my chest tighten, though I couldn't place why. It wasn't fear exactly, more a heightened awareness, a sense that I was completely alone in a vast, unwelcoming place. That night, sleep came slowly. The rain continued to fall, relentless, and every crack or groan from the cabin made me sit up in bed, listening. I eventually drifted off, only to wake hours later to the sound of the door handle rattling. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the handle turned slightly, slow and deliberate. My heart raced. I sat frozen, eyes straining in the dark. Then I realized the lock on the door was missing entirely. Someone could open it from the outside without effort. I debated getting my phone or flashlight, but the cabin was dark, and moving meant making noise. The sound stopped, but my mind raced. I told myself it was probably just a branch hitting the door or the wind, but every sense screamed caution. I stayed awake until morning, too tense to sleep, listening to the rain and the creaks and groans of the old cabin. By the time sunlight finally seeped through the grime on the windows, I was exhausted. The next day, I stayed inside, checking every door and window, inspecting locks, and looking for signs of entry. Everything seemed untouched, normal, but the feeling lingered, a deep sense of vulnerability. I spent the day chopping more firewood, cleaning, and trying to keep my mind occupied. Still, the quiet moments, the dripping water, the wind shaking the cabin, made me jumpy. That night, I slept slightly better, but only because I built a small barricade with furniture around the main door, just in case. I could hear the rain fading into wind, and I imagined the forest outside shifting, trees bending and twisting in ways that made shadows look like they moved on their own. On the third day, I decided to hike again, hoping that movement would calm my mind. The trail was muddy and slick, the forest dense. As I climbed higher, I noticed fresh tracks in the mud. They weren't mine. They were wide, heavy, and human. I froze, staring at them. Whoever or whatever had made them had been here recently. The tracks disappeared into the underbrush, heading parallel to my path. I followed cautiously, stepping lightly, listening. I found nothing else, but the unease settled deeper. When I returned to the cabin, the sun was low, and the shadows seemed longer than before. Inside, everything looked the same. No sign of forced entry, no movement, nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That night, the wind was fierce, rattling the cabin like a ship in a storm. Every tree outside thumped and groaned, and every sound made me tense. Around midnight, I heard something outside, A scraping, slow, deliberate, like someone moving something heavy across the ground. My heart pounded, my throat tight. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped toward the window. The beam cut through the darkness, and for a moment, I thought I saw a figure retreating into the trees. I held the light steady, but nothing moved. The wind picked up, rain returned in sharp bursts, and I realized that I had no choice but to stay inside, barricaded, listening to the storm and my own anxious heartbeat. The fourth day, I considered leaving. The forest was dense, the dirt road muddy and narrow, but I packed my things. As I stepped outside, the tracks from the previous day were still there, fresh and heavy, heading toward the cabin. I froze. Whoever had made them had been near while I slept. I didn't want to confront it, didn't want to get trapped. I went back inside, rethinking my plan. The storm had knocked down a few trees across the dirt track, making the exit more difficult. I realized that even if I wanted to leave quickly, I might not be able to without hours of clearing debris or carefully maneuvering my car through mud and fallen branches. By the fifth day, the storm had passed, leaving the forest wet, slippery, and quiet. I decided to hike cautiously back toward the main road, hoping to find cell service and call for help if needed. I moved slowly, watching every shadow, every sound. Along the trail, I saw more tracks, not just human but animal, bears, maybe deer. One set of tracks was too large and awkward to be a normal animal. I avoided it, stepping aside carefully, my heart hammering. It was clear that the cabin was not as safe as I had believed, and the isolation I had craved was now a dangerous reality. Back at the cabin, I fortified the doors and windows. I had brought a small camping stove, extra food, and water, just in case, but I realized that staying indefinitely wasn't an option. I began making plans to leave the next morning at first light, carefully marking the trail so I wouldn't get lost. That night, I barely slept. Every noise, the wind, a branch falling, distant animal calls, felt amplified. I stayed awake until the first hint of dawn, waiting, listening. When the morning came, I moved quickly. I packed everything efficiently, double-checked the cabin, and left a note in case anyone ever came looking for me. I retraced my path, carefully avoiding unstable ground and keeping an eye out for tracks. The forest seemed almost calm now, deceptive in its peace, but I remained alert. Hours later, I reached the main road, mud on my boots, exhaustion weighing me down, and finally, I saw another car approaching. Relief flooded me. I flagged it down, and the driver helped me navigate the last miles back to civilization. Back in town, I called the authorities to report the tracks near the cabin. They told me the area was remote, that trespassing and occasional hunters could leave signs like that. But they also warned me that wildlife was unpredictable and that isolation in the mountains could turn dangerous very quickly. I realized how lucky I had been. Lucky to leave without incident. Lucky that nothing had actually entered the cabin while I slept. The trip I had envisioned as peaceful solitude had become a lesson in vigilance, preparation, and respect for the unpredictable wilderness. I knew I would return someday, but never again without extreme caution, detailed plans, and awareness that isolation carries its own threats, human and animal alike. The experience stayed with me for months. Every quiet night, every creak in my own apartment floor made me think back to that cabin. The wind rattling the windows, the heavy tracks in the mud, the storm, the sense of being watched. It wasn't fear of ghosts or magic or anything supernatural. It was fear of reality, the raw unpredictability of the world when you are completely alone. And that fear was real, lasting, and something I would never forget.